It began with silence, the kind that only exists when the world is holding something back. In the Ardennes forest, snow rested undisturbed on pine branches, weighing them low, muting every sound beneath a thick white blanket. Roads wound through valleys like dark veins, frozen hard, their edges softened by drifts that hid ditches and danger alike. Villages slept beneath winter skies, chimneys breathing thin columns of smoke into air so cold it burned the lungs. For weeks, this stretch of the front had felt forgotten, quiet enough that some believed the war had already moved on. But silence can be a disguise. Behind the trees, beyond the ridge lines, and beneath the cover of cloud and snowfall, the German army was gathering what remained of its strength. Tanks were hidden beneath branches, heavy with frost. Infantry units moved at night, boots wrapped, engines silenced, orders whispered instead of shouted. Fuel was scarce, ammunition was rationed, time itself felt thin. And yet, for the men preparing to move forward, there was a single, shared understanding this was not just another attack, it was a gamble against the future. The German Ardennes Offensive was born from desperation, sharpened into resolve. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its consequences. A sudden strike through terrain the Allies believed impassable, a drive westward through snow and forest, a rupture in the Allied front so deep and sudden it might fracture the entire war in the West. If it worked, the momentum could change. If it failed, there would be nothing left to recover. In the early hours of a bitter December morning, the forest exploded. Artillery fire tore through the quiet with shocking violence. Shells burst among trees, shattering trunks and sending splinters screaming through the air. Snow erupted in violent plumes, turning white into grey chaos. Communication lines vanished in seconds. Outposts were swallowed whole. Men stumbled from foxholes into a world that no longer made sense, the ground trembling beneath them as if the earth itself had turned hostile. German infantry surged forward through the smoke, their silhouettes flickering between trees. Tanks followed where roads allowed, grinding through ice and snow, their engines roaring now with nothing left to conceal. The offensive hit positions held by tired American units spread thin across miles of forest. Some were experienced, others were newly arrived. Few expected an attack of this scale, and none expected it here. The Ardennes became a maze of confusion. Fog rolled in thick enough to swallow entire companies. Snowfall reduced visibility to a handful of yards. Roads clogged with vehicles moving in opposite directions. Orders were lost, misunderstood, or never delivered. Small groups fought isolated battles, unsure if help was hours away or already gone. Villages like Street, Veith and Bastogne suddenly mattered more than their size suggested. Crossroads became lifelines. High ground became salvation. Farmhouses turned into strongpoints, their stone walls absorbing bullets and shrapnel meant for men huddled inside. Civilians hid in cellars, listening to tanks grind past overhead, counting the seconds between explosions. The German advance pushed deep, carving a bulge into the Allied line that gave the battle its name. Columns moved westward under cover of poor weather, avoiding Allied aircraft grounded by cloud and snow. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed possible that the gamble might work. Fuel dumps were overrun, units were encircled, retreats turned chaotic, maps were redrawn in frantic pencil strokes, but winter is an enemy that does not choose sides. As days passed, fuel shortages slowed the German armour, vehicles were abandoned along roadsides, frozen into place. Infantry marched on foot through drifts that reached their knees, exhaustion hollowing faces already gaunt from years of war. Supplies failed to arrive, communications fractured, momentum began to bleed away, and then the skies cleared. Sunlight cut through the clouds like a blade, revealing everything that had been hidden. Allied aircraft returned in overwhelming numbers, their engines filling the cold air with a sound that promised destruction. Fighter bombers descended on crowded roads, on stalled convoys, on bridges choked with retreat. Rockets and bombs tore through columns trapped with nowhere to hide. Smoke rose in thick black towers, marking the end of hope with brutal clarity. On the ground, the Allies stabilized, then counterattacked. Encircled units fought their way, free or held, until relief arrived. Bastogne became a symbol of resistance, surrounded, frozen, battered, yet unbroken. Fresh divisions poured into the Ardennes, grinding forward through forests stripped bare by shell fire. Artillery pounded ridgelines, tanks clawed back ground inch by inch. What had been a sudden surge turned into a slow collapse. The German Ardennes Offensive did not end with a single defeat. It ended with exhaustion, with dwindling fuel, with broken formations, with men retreating through the same forests they had once advanced through, now under open sky and relentless pressure. When the fighting finally subsided, the Ardennes was transformed. Snow-covered hills were scarred black with craters, villages lay in ruins, their streets filled with debris and silence. Forests stood shattered, trunks snapped and burned, branches hanging low over frozen ground that held the memory of every step taken in fear or resolve. The offensive had failed, and with it faded Germany's last real chance to alter the course of the war in the West. Tonight, we return to that winter gamble, to the forests heavy with snow, to the roads that funneled hope and despair alike, to the sudden violence that shattered quiet fronts, to the soldiers on all sides who endured cold, confusion, and fear in a battle shaped as much by weather as by will. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to ask you something gentle, something personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour has settled around you? Is it late and quiet where you are, or does the night still feel alive? And something deeper, unique to this episode, the Ardennes Offensive reminds us how quickly certainty can vanish, how even a quiet moment can become a turning point. In your own life, has there been a time when everything changed suddenly, without warning? If you feel comfortable, share what that moment taught you. And if these long, immersive journeys into the past help your breathing slow, your thoughts soften, or your mind drift toward rest, consider subscribing. November 28th, 1944. The forests of Luxembourg stood silent under low winter clouds. Lieutenant Joseph Harmon, 28th Infantry Division, studied the German lines through his binoculars, seeing nothing but bare trees and snow-dusted earth. Behind him, a corporal made coffee over a small fire. The war felt distant here, almost peaceful. In 2 weeks, Harmon would be dead, killed by an army that did not yet exist, or so every intelligence report insisted. Across no man's land, hidden beneath camouflage nets that mimicked the forest canopy, 1,420 German artillery pieces waited in perfect silence. The Ardennes sector had become what soldiers called a ghost front, a quiet place where divisions recovered from brutal fighting elsewhere, where green troops learned what war smelled like before experiencing its full fury. The 99th Infantry Division, fresh from training camps in America, held a 27-mile stretch of front line. Standard military doctrine called for 5 miles per division. Nobody seemed concerned. The Germans were finished, everyone said. Intelligence estimates from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces in Versailles painted a picture of Wehrmacht collapse. The enemy was retreating, disorganized, scrambling to defend the Rhine River and the approaches to Germany itself. What Allied intelligence officers did not know, could not have imagined, was that they were staring directly at 250,000 German soldiers who had materialized in the Ardennes forests like ghosts, assembled over 4 weeks in one of history's most successful strategic deceptions. The deception began with a name, Operation Wacht am Rhine Watch on the Rhine. Even the code name was a lie, deliberately chosen to suggest defensive preparations, the kind of operation a defeated army would mount to protect its borders. German commanders enforced radio silence with fanatical discipline. Tank crews were forbidden from using radios. Infantry units communicated by courier, young soldiers running messages through the forests at night. Artillery pieces moved only after dark, their tracks swept away each dawn with tree branches carried for exactly this purpose. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, what few Germany still had, were grounded for 3 weeks before the offensive. Not a single plane flew over the Ardennes, eliminating any risk of Allied observers detecting the massive buildup. The Wehrmacht, supposedly on its last legs, had learned from 4 years of war how to hide an army in plain sight. The Allied intelligence apparatus, one of the war's most sophisticated, missed every sign. Ultra intercepts, the secret British program that decoded German communications, captured virtually nothing about the offensive because there was nothing electronic to intercept. The German General Staff conducted the entire operation planning through hand-delivered documents and face-to-face meetings. When German officers did use radio, they transmitted only routine defensive messages, carefully crafted to reinforce the illusion that nothing unusual was happening in the West. American G2 intelligence officers, reading ultra transcripts that showed no unusual activity, concluded that Germany had neither the resources nor the will for offensive operations. A December 12th assessment from Shaef headquarters stated with confidence, "The enemy is incapable of major offensive operations." On December 15th, thousands of German assault troops emerged from their concealed positions in the Schnee-Eifel forests, moving toward the front line under cover of darkness. American sentries, peering into the winter night, saw and heard nothing. Individual warning signs existed, scattered across the Ardennes sector like puzzle pieces nobody thought to assemble. On December 10th, a German deserter crossed into American lines near Monschau and told interrogators that a massive attack was coming. Intelligence officers dismissed him as a plant, a deliberate deception by German counterintelligence. Civilians from Luxembourg reported seeing German troops massing in the forests. Reconnaissance patrols noted that German defensive positions seemed unusually quiet, too quiet, some said. Forward observers detected sounds of heavy vehicle movement at night but couldn't confirm what they'd heard. All these fragments of information travelled up the chain of command and died there, smothered by institutional certainty that Germany was finished. The intelligence failure had many fathers: overconfidence from recent Allied victories, exhaustion after 5 months of continuous offensive operations since Normandy, and simple human psychology, the tendency to see what you expect to see rather than what actually exists. Behind the Allied lines, the mood was almost relaxed. Combat veterans enjoyed hot meals and wrote letters home. Replacement troops, fresh off ships from America, tried to act like the combat wasn't terrifying them. The 106th Infantry Division had been on the line for only 5 days. Many soldiers had never fired their weapons in combat. They dug foxholes in the frozen ground and wondered when they'd see actual fighting. The Ardennes was supposed to be the easy sector, the place where nothing happened. Officers planned Christmas parties. Supply sergeants stockpiled holiday rations, turkey, cranberry sauce, fruitcake. In the town of Bastogne, Belgian civilians decorated their homes with whatever Christmas ornaments they'd saved through 4 years of occupation. American military police directed traffic through the crossroads, 7 roads converging on the town square. Nobody paid much attention to the strategic importance of these roads, how they were the only paved routes through the entire Ardennes forest, how controlling them meant controlling movement across the entire region. The German buildup happened in layers, each element carefully sequenced to avoid detection. First came the infantry divisions, moving into assembly areas closest to the front line. They travelled at night, hiding in farm buildings and forests during daylight. Next came the artillery, the 1,420 guns that would shatter the American defences in the opening barrage. Ammunition followed, thousands of tons stockpiled in carefully camouflaged dumps. Then the armour arrived, the panzer divisions that were supposed to smash through the American lines and race to the Meuse River. King Tiger tanks, the heaviest and most powerful tanks in the world, rumbled along forest trails that engineers had reinforced in secret. Panther tanks, with their 75mm guns that could kill any Allied tank at 2,000 yards, took positions behind the assault infantry. The Wehrmacht moved an entire army into attack position over 4 weeks, and not one Allied aircraft spotted the concentration because not one Allied aircraft was looking for it. On December 14th, forward German units received sealed orders marked to be opened at 0500 hours on December 16th. Commanders gathered their men in barns and forests, speaking in whispers about what was coming. Assault troops checked their weapons one last time. Engineers prepared Bangalore torpedoes to blow through American wire obstacles. Artillery crews calculated firing solutions for every American strongpoint they'd identified through weeks of observation. Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead unit commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper, received special fuel allocations and priority road assignments. They would lead the main thrust, punching through American lines and racing west toward the Meuse River crossings. Piper gathered his officers and told them the operation's objective in Hitler's own words: "We will split the Americans and British. We will drive to Antwerp. We will destroy them." December 15th, 1944. Night fell over the Ardennes. American sentries peered into the darkness, seeing nothing unusual. Behind them, in squad tents and farmhouses, their comrades slept or played cards or wrote final letters home. Across no man's land, 250,000 German soldiers waited in perfect silence, counting down the hours. The Phantom Army was about to become horrifyingly real. At 0535 the next morning, the forest would erupt in fire and thunder. The largest battle on the Western Front was 12 hours away, and not one Allied commander believed it was coming. Intelligence officers in warm headquarters reviewed their reports one last time, finding nothing alarming. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower attended a wedding in Versailles, unconcerned about the quiet sector to the north. In the Ardennes forests, the last watch changed. New sentries took their positions, stamping their feet against the cold, counting down the hours until dawn. The ghost front was about to explode. Everything Allied intelligence believed about German capabilities was wrong. Every assumption about Wehrmacht intentions was backwards. The quiet sector was the most dangerous place on Earth, and in 12 hours, when searchlights suddenly illuminated low clouds and 1,400 artillery pieces fired as one, the illusion of Allied invincibility would shatter like glass. The German army, supposedly defeated and demoralized, was about to launch the most ambitious offensive of the entire Western Front campaign. The Americans, confident and comfortable, were about to fight for their lives. The Battle of the Bulge, though nobody called it that yet, was hours away from beginning, and the Phantom Army, hidden so long and so well, was finally ready to strike. September 16th, 1944. The Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortress headquarters, deep in the forests of East Prussia, smelled of damp concrete and desperation. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel entered the conference room to find the Führer bent over maps, his left hand trembling with the palsy that no amount of willpower could control. Outside, the Eastern Front was collapsing. Soviet armies stood at the borders of Poland. In the west, American and British forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing toward Germany. The war, by any rational assessment, was lost. Hitler looked up from the maps and announced, "I have made a momentous decision." What followed was a plan so audacious, so divorced from military reality, that every general who heard it believed their leader had finally succumbed to complete delusion. They were partially right and partially terrifyingly wrong. The genesis of the Ardennes Offensive lay in Hitler's accurate understanding of one crucial fact. The Western Allies were not a unified force, but a coalition held together by temporary shared interest. Britain and America, Hitler believed, would never accept Soviet domination of Europe. If Germany could deliver a devastating blow to American forces, if German armies could inflict a defeat so shocking it shook American public, well then perhaps Roosevelt would seek a negotiated peace. Perhaps the unnatural alliance between capitalist democracies and communist dictatorship would fracture. Perhaps Germany could survive to fight another day, to negotiate terms that preserved some remnant of the Reich. It was fantasy built on fragments of geopolitical truth. The plan was militarily impossible, but strategically coherent, which made it the most dangerous kind of desperation. Hitler's finger traced the route on the map, from the German border through the Ardennes forests to the Meuse River crossings, and finally to Antwerp. 120 miles in 7 days. Antwerp was the key to everything. Through that single Belgian port flowed 800,000 tons of Allied supplies every month, the fuel and ammunition and food that sustained 2 million Allied soldiers pushing toward Germany. Capturing Antwerp would cut off 500,000 Allied troops. British and Canadian forces in the north would be isolated, starving, desperate. It would be Dunkirk in reverse. The British Expeditionary Force trapped again, but this time with no evacuation possible. And if the Western Allies were defeated, if they sued for peace or, at minimum, suspended operations for months to regroup, then Germany could shift every division east to face the Soviets. The plan required everything to go perfectly. That should have been the first clue it would fail. The generals opposed it unanimously. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, nominal commander in the West, called it a stroke of genius in Hitler's presence, and mad, completely mad to his staff. Field Marshal Walter Model, who would actually direct the offensive, proposed a smaller encirclement operation with achievable objectives. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, calculated the road network could not support the required forces. Every professional military officer who reviewed the plan identified the same fatal flaws: insufficient fuel, inadequate air cover, impossible timetable, total reliance on Allied incompetence. Hitler rejected every modification. The plan would proceed exactly as conceived: Antwerp or nothing, victory or apocalypse. It was characteristic of Hitler's military thinking by late 1944, the belief that willpower could overcome mathematics, that German soldiers fighting for their homeland could achieve what logistics said was impossible. The resource calculations were damning. Germany's synthetic fuel production, crippled by Allied bombing, now yielded 98,000 barrels per day, down from 316,000 barrels in early 1944. The offensive would require 12 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Wehrmacht quartermasters calculated they could stockpile 5 million gallons. The shortfall, 7 million gallons, was supposed to come from captured American fuel dumps. The offensive's success depended on seizing intact the very supplies needed to continue the offensive. It was circular logic as military planning. Von Manteuffel, the most pragmatic of the panzer commanders, told Model, "We have fuel for perhaps 150 miles of operations. We need 250 miles to reach Antwerp." Model shrugged and replied, "Then we must capture American fuel in the first 48 hours." The plan required the enemy to cooperate in their own destruction. But Hitler's strategic reading of Allied vulnerabilities was not entirely wrong. The Western Alliance was showing cracks. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and American General Omar Bradley feuded constantly over strategy and resources. American General George Patton considered Montgomery a cautious prima donna. Montgomery thought American generals were reckless amateurs. Supreme Commander Eisenhower spent as much time managing personalities as planning operations. The coalition was winning, but not harmoniously, and Allied intelligence had developed a dangerous overconfidence, dismissing German capabilities, assuming the Wehrmacht was on its last legs. Hitler was betting that one massive shock, one catastrophic surprise that shattered Allied assumptions could exploit these fissures. He was gambling that American public opinion, already wary after 3 years of global war, would not tolerate another year of casualties if Germany proved it could still strike devastating blows. It was psychological warfare masked as military strategy. On October 11th, Hitler summoned his senior commanders to the Reich Chancellery in Berlin and presented the final plan. Keitel read the directive. "The decisive battle of the war will be fought in the West. Success will determine Germany's survival. 3 armies would attack: 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, 5th Panzer Army in the center, 7th Army in the south. 30 divisions, 600,000 men when fully assembled. The primary objective was crossing the Meuse River between Liège and Namur within 48 hours. Secondary objective was Antwerp within 7 days. Hitler walked to the map and drew the arrow with his own hand. A sharp thrust from the Ardennes through the American lines, to the river, to the port, to victory." Generals stared at the map in silence. Von Rundstedt finally spoke. "Mein Führer, the plan requires circumstances that cannot be guaranteed. Weather, fuel, Allied response time." Hitler cut him off. "I am aware of what it requires. I am also aware we have no alternative." Dismissed. The operational details fell to Model and von Manteuffel, professional soldiers trying to make a fantasy workable. They modified what they could within Hitler's constraints. Von Manteuffel convinced Hitler to launch dawn rather than night, arguing German troops needed to sea to exploit breakthroughs. Model streamlined supply routes, identified which units would get fuel priority when shortages emerged. Because shortages would emerge, 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by Josef Sepp Dietrich, received the best equipment and priority fuel allocation. Dietrich was a Nazi loyalist, a party man rather than a professional soldier, but Hitler trusted him completely. 1st SS Panzer Division within Dietrich's army included Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead unit that would lead the main thrust. Piper was 30 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, ruthless and efficient. He was given the newest King Tiger tanks and told, "Break through at any cost, reach the Meuse in 48 hours, nothing else matters." The final planning sessions took place in November at Ziegenberg, Hitler's Western headquarters. Security was obsessive. Division commanders were summoned individually, forbidden from taking notes, required to sign statements acknowledging that revealing anything about the operation meant immediate execution. Hitler briefed them personally, his voice hoarse but fervent, describing the offensive as Germany's last chance for survival. "We must seize this opportunity," he told the assembled officers. "The Americans are overconfident, scattered, unprepared. Their alliance with Britain is brittle. One powerful blow will shatter their will." Some officers believed him, most did not, but understood they had no choice. Failure meant Soviet occupation of all Germany. The offensive might be impossible, but defensive operations guaranteed defeat. At least attacking offered a chance, however remote, of changing the strategic equation. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, delivered the final resource assessment on November 25th. The numbers were brutal. Germany could equip and fuel the offensive once. There were no reserves for a second attempt. The ammunition stockpiled in the Ardennes forests represented months of production. The fuel allocation emptied every reserve depot in the west. The tanks and assault guns committed to the offensive were nearly everything Germany had left. If the attack failed, the Western Front would be defenseless. Speer told Hitler, "After this operation, we will have insufficient resources to defend the Rhine." Hitler replied, "If this operation fails, defending the Rhine will be irrelevant. We will have lost the war." It was the most honest assessment Hitler had made in months. The Ardennes Offensive was not a gambit to win the war, it was a desperate attempt to avoid losing it immediately. And so the machine was set in motion. Through November and early December, while Allied intelligence saw nothing alarming, 250,000 German soldiers moved into position. Trains ran at night, vehicles drove without headlights. Artillery pieces were manhandled into firing positions by crews wearing cloth boots to muffle sound. The greatest assembly of German military power in the West since 1940 waited for the signal to attack. It was brilliant in execution and insane in conception, the product of a regime that had lost touch with reality but retained terrifying organizational competence. Hitler's last gambit was doomed from the start, but before it failed, it would nearly succeed. And in those first terrible days of the offensive, when German armies smashed through American defenses and drove west toward the Meuse, the impossible plan would look almost achievable. That was the tragedy and the horror of the Ardennes Offensive. Not that it failed, but that it came so close to catastrophic success. October 24th, 1944. Field Marshal Walter Model stood in his headquarters south of Cologne, studying aerial reconnaissance photographs of the Ardennes region with mounting concern. The photographs showed what every senior Wehrmacht officer already knew. The terrain was a nightmare. Narrow roads twisted through dense forests. Steep valleys channeled movement into predictable corridors. Rivers cut across the advance routes at regular intervals, each requiring intact bridges that American engineers could destroy with a few pounds of explosives. Model lit a cigarette and told his staff, "We are being asked to push an army through a funnel." The funnel was 60 miles wide at the base, the German start line, and had to narrow to a few Meuse River crossing points 120 miles west. Every division, every tank battalion, every supply truck would have to squeeze through the same handful of roads. It was a traffic planner's nightmare and a tactician's suicide mission. The fundamental problem was mathematical. Operation Wacht am Rhein required moving 30 divisions through terrain that had only 5 paved roads running east to west. Model's staff calculated that under perfect conditions, no resistance, no demolished bridges, no traffic jams, the advance would take 4 days to cover 100 miles. The plan called for reaching the Meuse in 2 days. To compensate for the impossible timeline, German planners had to assume everything would break in their favor. Surprise would be total, American resistance would collapse, bridges would be captured intact, roads would remain clear. The plan had no contingency for anything going wrong, because once anything went wrong, the entire timeline collapsed. Model's chief of staff, a veteran of the Eastern Front, observed, "We are building a plan where success requires the enemy's cooperation. That is not a plan. That is a prayer." General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army in the center of the assault, fought Hitler over every detail he could modify. Von Manteuffel was a professional soldier, an aristocrat from old Prussian military families, and he understood that battles were won by soldiers, not by lines drawn on maps in Berlin. He convinced Hitler to launch the attack at dawn rather than at night, arguing that panzer crews needed visibility to exploit breakthroughs. He restructured the assault formations, putting his most experienced units at the front where they could shatter American defenses in the first hours. He identified specific objectives for each division street: Vith for the infantry, Baston for the mobile forces, river crossings at Dinant, and Namur for the panzer spearheads. Every objective was a choke point, a place where roads converged, where controlling terrain meant controlling movement. If the Americans held these locations, the offensive would strangle on its own logistics. To the north, 6th SS Panzer Army prepared for the main thrust. Josef Sepp Dietrich commanded this formation, and his force included the best equipment Germany still possessed. 1st SS Panzer Division, the Spearhead, received 72 tanks, including the newest King Tiger models with their 88mm guns that could kill any Allied tank at 3,000 yards. Kampfgruppe Paper, commanded by SS Obersturmenführer Joachim Paper, was built around these tanks, 4,800 men, 600 vehicles. The strike force that would lead the race to the Meuse. Piper received special orders: ignore resistance unless it directly blocked his route, bypass strong points, refuel from captured American supplies, and reach the Meuse at any cost. Speed was everything. Hesitation meant death. Piper's task was not to fight battles, but to outrun American response, to be across the Meuse before the Allies understood what was happening. The road assignments revealed the operation's fundamental fragility. 5th Panzer Army in the centre received routes 23 and 15, two narrow roads that wound through the Ardennes forests. 6th SS Panzer Army in the north got Route 12 and several minor roads barely wide enough for tanks. 7th Army in the south, which had no armour and was supposed to protect the offensive's southern flank, received whatever roads the other armies didn't need. The entire operational plan funneled 600,000 men and 1,400 armoured vehicles through road networks designed for peacetime traffic between Belgian villages. German traffic control officers looked at the assignments and immediately identified the crisis points crossroads where multiple units would converge, narrow valleys where a single destroyed vehicle could block movement for hours, bridges with weight limits that prohibited the heaviest tanks. Every crisis point was mapped, none could be avoided. The roads dictated the battle more than the plans did. Logistics governed everything. Each panzer division consumed 50,000 gallons of fuel per day of active operations. 5th Panzer Army alone had 8 armoured divisions. Simple multiplication showed the horror. 400,000 gallons daily for one army times 7 days to Antwerp equals 2.8 million gallons minimum, and that assumed no diversions, no extended combat, no traffic jams, burning fuel while stationary. The Wehrmacht Quartermaster Corps stockpiled 5 million gallons for all three armies combined. The math did not work. It had never worked. Every logistician who reviewed the fuel plan reached the same conclusion. The offensive could advance approximately 150 miles before running dry. Antwerp was 250 miles from the start line. The shortfall 100 miles was designated on planning documents as to be captured from enemy stocks. The plan required seizing American fuel dumps intact in the first 48 hours, then advancing on captured fuel while Allied forces helpfully refrained from destroying their own supplies. To maximize surprise, German forces would attack without the usual preliminary bombardment that warned defenders of impending assault. Instead, they developed a deception plan within the deception plan. At 0530, 30 minutes before the assault, the forests along the entire front would erupt with searchlight beams aimed at low clouds. The reflected light would create artificial daylight, allowing assault troops to see without using flares that would warn American defenders. Then, at 0535, every German artillery piece would fire simultaneously 1,400 guns, releasing hell in one coordinated volley designed to shatter American communications, destroy command posts, and paralyze response. The infantry assault would follow immediately, rushing forward before defenders recovered from the shock. This was blitzkrieg methodology, refined by 4 years of war. Violence of action, tempo that prevented coherent response, exploitation before the enemy understood what was happening. The bridge problem obsessed German planners. Between the start line and the Meuse River, the advance routes crossed dozens of rivers and streams: the Our, the Somme, the Amblev, the Auve, and finally the Meuse itself. Every crossing required a bridge. Every bridge could be demolished. American combat engineers, specifically trained in demolition techniques, could drop any bridge in Europe with 15 minutes' notice. The entire German plan depended on capturing at least some bridges intact before American engineers realized they were in danger. Special assault teams, equipped with wire cutters and Bangalore torpedoes to clear obstacles, received orders to rush the bridges ahead of the main force. Sappers carried repair equipment to improvise crossings if bridges fell. Every bridge was a potential campaign-ending failure point. The Meuse crossings were designated as do-or-die objectives. If German forces could not cross the Meuse, they could not reach Antwerp. If they could not reach Antwerp, the offensive achieved nothing. Weather became a critical factor that planners could only hope to exploit. Germany needed fog and clouds to ground Allied aircraft. The Luftwaffe, decimated by years of attrition, could muster perhaps 400 fighters to support the offensive. Allied air forces based in France, Belgium, and Britain fielded more than 5,000 operational aircraft. In clear weather, Allied fighter bombers would turn German supply columns into burning wreckage. within hours, but December in the Ardennes typically brought fog, low clouds, and snow weather that grounded aircraft and reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. German meteorologists predicted 10 days of poor flying weather starting December 15th, 10 days to break through, cross the Meuse, and reach Antwerp before American air power could respond. The offensive was scheduled around a weather forecast, gambling that nature would cooperate with military necessity. On December 10th, division commanders received their sealed orders with instructions not to open them until 0500 hours on December 16th. The documents outlined objectives, routes, and a final reminder from Hitler himself. This operation will determine whether Germany survives or perishes. There is no third option. Every man must understand that hesitation equals death, not just for himself, but for the fatherland. Model added his own directive, more practical. Speed is the only weapon we have against superior Allied numbers. A fast advance that bypasses resistance is worth 10 set-piece battles. Do not stop to fight. Do not stop to consolidate. Drive west and do not look back. It was doctrine born of desperation but sound tactically. The only way to negate Allied advantages in numbers and air power was to move so fast that those advantages could not be brought to bear. The blueprint was complete. 3 armies would attack across a 60-mile front. 6th SS Panzer Army would make the main thrust through the northern Ardennes, targeting Liège and the Meuse crossings beyond. 5th Panzer Army would drive through the centre, isolating Streetvith and Bastogne, creating chaos in the American rear. 7th Army would protect the southern flank, holding back American reinforcements from Patton's 3rd Army. The operation was supposed to be lightning warfare, breakthrough, exploitation, triumph, compressed into 7 days of continuous advance. It was brilliant in conception, the product of Germany's best military minds trying to execute an impossible mission, and it was doomed from the start, because brilliant tactics cannot overcome strategic impossibility. But for a few terrible days in December 1944, before the plan's inherent contradictions became undeniable, it would work terrifyingly well. The lightning was about to strike. December 16th, 1944, 0528 hours, Private John Williams, 127th Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, stood watch in a foxhole near the German border, stamping his feet against the cold. His breath formed clouds in the darkness. Somewhere in the forest behind him, a lieutenant was brewing coffee over a squad stove. Williams checked his watch 2 minutes until he could wake his replacement and grab a hot cup before the position changed at 0600. The forest was absolutely silent. Nothing moved. Williams thought about home, about Christmas leave that was supposedly coming in January, about how quiet this sector was compared to stories he'd heard from veterans who fought in Normandy. At exactly 0530, the forest turned bright as noon, and Williams had 3 seconds to register that searchlight beams were bouncing off low clouds, turning night into artificial day, before the entire world exploded. 1,400 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously across a 60-mile front. The sound was beyond human comprehension, not a series of explosions, but a single sustained roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. American positions erupted in fountains of frozen dirt and shattered trees. High explosive shells, each containing 50 pounds of explosive, detonated among foxholes that had seemed safe minutes earlier. Communications trenches collapsed, command posts disintegrated, telephone lines, the primary means of communication between units, snapped under the barrage. Williams was thrown against the rear wall of his foxhole by concussion, his ears bleeding, unable to hear anything except a high-pitched ringing that would last for days. Around him, the 99th Infantry Division's forward positions simply ceased to exist as organised defensive points. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. By the time it ended, the American front line had been transformed from a coherent defensive system into scattered groups of shocked survivors trying to understand what had happened. The searchlight technique was German innovation from the Eastern Front. By aiming powerful searchlights at low clouds and fog, assault troops created reflected artificial moonlight that illuminated the battlefield without exposing individual light sources to counter battery fire. American soldiers, emerging from the safety of their positions after the barrage, looked toward German lines and saw nothing, just reflected glow and fog and the shadows of moving figures. At 0700 hours, the German infantry assault began. Entire divisions advanced through morning mists that reduced visibility to 50 yards. American forward observers, the troops responsible for calling artillery support, found their radios jammed by German electronic warfare units. Those whose radios still functioned discovered their telephone lines to headquarters were dead, cut by the preliminary barrage. The front line was isolated, unable to call for help, unable even to report what was happening. The psychological impact was devastating. The 99th Infantry Division had been in position for only 3 weeks. The 106th Infantry Division, deployed just south of the 99th, had been on the line for exactly 5 days. Many soldiers had never experienced combat. Training prepared men for what combat was supposed to be, like methodical advances, clear orders, visible enemies. The German assault was chaos incarnate. Veterans from Normandy later said the Ardennes bombardment was worse than anything they'd experienced, and these were men who'd survived D-Day. Staff Sergeant George Franklin, a Normandy veteran serving with the 28th Infantry Division, wrote in his diary, "The Krauts are supposed to be finished. They're not supposed to have this many guns. This isn't supposed to be happening." At 0730, V-1 flying bombs, Hitler's vengeance weapons that had terrorized London, began striking American rear area positions. These pilotless bombs, primitive cruise missiles carrying 1-ton warheads, targeted communication centers and crossroads 10 to 15 miles behind the front line. The goal was not just to kill soldiers, but to destroy the nerve system that allowed American units to coordinate response. At Trois-Ponts, a critical road junction, a V-1 demolished the traffic control post, killing the military police who directed vehicle movement. At Street, Vith, another V-1 struck a telephone exchange, severing communications between forward units and division headquarters. The German plan was working exactly as designed: total surprise, overwhelming violence, paralysis of command and control. American units were fighting blind, unable to communicate with each other or with higher headquarters, uncertain whether they faced a local probe or something far more dangerous. The Losheim Gap became the breach point where German forces achieved their deepest penetration on the first day. This natural corridor through the Ardennes forests had been considered unimportant by American planners. The terrain was too difficult for large-scale armor operations, or so everyone assumed. The 14th Cavalry Group, a reconnaissance unit with light armored cars rather than tanks, held the gap with just 18 men per mile of front. At 0715, German infantry from the 3rd Parachute Division and 12th Volksgrenadier Division struck the cavalry positions from 3 sides simultaneously. The outnumbered Americans fought for 2 hours before withdrawing, abandoning positions they could not hold. By 0900 hours, the Losheim Gap was in German hands, opening a 6-mile-wide corridor through which panzer divisions would pour into the American rear. Captain Joseph Carter, commanding a forward artillery battery supporting the 99th Division, watched German forces advancing through morning fog and made a decision that violated every tactical doctrine he'd been taught. His battery was positioned to fire in support of infantry shells aimed forward into enemy territory. The German assault had already bypassed his position. Enemy infantry was advancing from the northeast, behind where the American front line had been. Carter ordered his guns to reverse direction, firing at targets behind their own lines, trying to hit German formations moving through the forest. His battery fired 150 rounds before German tanks arrived. Carter ordered withdrawal, abandoning 4 artillery pieces, because there was no time to limber them for towing. As his unit retreated west on dirt roads clogged with refugees and scattered American troops, Carter understood what his training had never prepared him for. They were not holding a defensive line that was being pressed. The defensive line no longer existed. The Germans were already in the rear area, and nobody knew how far they penetrated. The Schnee Eifel, a forested ridge east of Streetvith, became a death trap for the 106th Infantry Division. 2 regiments, approximately 7,000 men, held positions on the ridge, defending against what they assumed was the German front line. The December 16th assault revealed the terrible mistake. German forces had bypassed the Schnee Eifel on both sides, advancing through forests to the north and south, isolating the American positions. By noon, the 2 regiments were surrounded, cut off from resupply, unable to retreat without fighting through German units that now controlled their rear. Division Commander Major General Alan Jones, commanding from Streetvith, sent radio messages ordering the regiments to withdraw. The messages never arrived. German jamming blocked radio frequencies. Courier runners sent through the forests were captured or killed. The 7,000 men on the Schnee Eifel would hold their positions for 3 more days, not realizing they were already encircled and doomed. At Shaiv headquarters in Versailles, 400 miles from the Ardennes, the first fragmentary reports arrived mid-morning. Staff officers read messages describing German attacks, trying to assess scope and severity. The language was cautious, bureaucratic, enemy pressure in Ardennes sector, local counterattacks in divisional areas, communication difficulties preventing full situation reports. Nothing suggested catastrophe. The Allies had grown accustomed to German counterattacks, small operations designed to buy time or shorten defensive lines. Intelligence officers reviewed the reports and concluded this was another spoiling attack, probably 4 or 5 divisions, the enemy trying to disrupt Allied offensive preparations. Nobody imagined the truth that 30 German divisions were attacking across a 60-mile front, that the American front line had effectively ceased to exist in multiple sectors, that Panzer spearheads were already miles into the rear area. The fog of war was absolute. By nightfall, December 16th, the first day of the offensive, German forces had penetrated 2 to 5 miles along most of the front. In the Lochheim Gap, the deepest penetration reached 8 miles. Thousands of American soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Entire battalions had disintegrated under the assault, scattered into small groups of survivors trying to escape west. Communications remained chaotic. Some units still believed they faced local attacks, while others understood they were in the middle of a catastrophic breakthrough and were desperately trying to warn higher headquarters. The 106th Division had lost effective command of 2 regiments on the Schnee Eifel. The 99th Division held fragments of its line but had abandoned forward positions. The 28th Division's front had been penetrated in multiple locations, and behind the chaos of the infantry battle, German panzer divisions were moving into attack positions, preparing to exploit the breakthrough and drive west toward objectives American commanders didn't yet know were threatened. Hell's Orchestra had played its opening movement. The bombardment was over, but the symphony of destruction was just beginning. In the forests and villages of the Ardennes, thousands of American soldiers who'd been eating breakfast and writing letters home 12 hours earlier were now dead or captured or fleeing west through snow and mud. The quiet sector had become the most violent place on earth. And the real horror, the part that would make December 16th, 1944, one of the darkest days in American military history, was that almost nobody in Allied command yet understood what was happening. They thought this was a spoiling attack. They were wrong. This was the Wehrmacht's last great offensive, and it was just getting started. December 17th, 1944, 0300 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper, commander of Kampfgruppe Paper, stood on the turret of his lead King Tiger tank near the village of Lochheim, watching his armoured columns stretch back into darkness. Behind him, 600 vehicles, tanks, halfracks, trucks, artillery tractors waited to advance west through the breakthrough the infantry had created. Piper checked his watch. By this hour, according to the operational timeline, his spearhead should have been 20 miles west, approaching the Amblev River. Instead, he had advanced exactly 3 miles in 6 hours. The road ahead was blocked by horse-drawn artillery from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, moving at walking pace, unable to clear the route. Behind Piper's tanks, the entire 1st SS Panzer Division sat motionless, burning fuel and going nowhere. The brilliant plan was strangling on its own logistics before the battle had even truly begun. The fundamental problem was simple mathematics applied to geography. Operation Wacht am Rhein required moving 30 divisions through terrain that had exactly 5 paved roads running east to west. Each road was approximately 18 feet wide, just wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass if both drove carefully. A Panther tank, Germany's primary medium tank, measured 11 feet 6 inches wide. There was no room for error, no space for passing slower vehicles, no way to route around obstacles. Every breakdown, every demolished bridge, every knocked-out vehicle became a crisis that cascaded backward through the entire column. And in the first days of the offensive, breakdowns happened constantly. Tanks that had been hidden in forests for weeks, their engines cold-started after prolonged inactivity, through tracks and seized transmissions. Vehicles collided in darkness on icy roads. Accidents multiplied catastrophically. At 0900 hours, December 17th, near the village of Manderfeld, 2 separate panzer columns collided at a forest crossroads. Nobody had coordinated which unit would use which road. 1st SS Panzer Division, advancing from the north, reached the intersection simultaneously with 12th SS Panzer Division, advancing from the northeast. For 3 hours, company commanders argued about priority while hundreds of vehicles sat motionless, their engines running, consuming irreplaceable fuel. Military police finally restored order by forcing 12th SS to reverse course and take a parallel route, which added 8 miles and 4 hours to their advance. By the time movement resumed, the entire northern axis of the offensive had lost most of a day. Hitler's 72-hour timeline to reach the Meuse was already impossible, and it was only day 2. The American demolition program compounded German misery. Combat engineers, specifically trained in bridge demolition, had pre-positioned explosives on every significant bridge in the Ardennes. Even as American infantry retreated, engineers remained at their posts, waiting until German forces were in sight before blowing their charges. At Our, a key bridge over the Our River, engineers waited until Panther tanks from 5th Panzer Army were 200 yards away before destroying the span. The explosion killed the lead tank crew and dropped 100 tons of concrete and steel into the river. German assault engineers took 12 hours to construct a temporary crossing capable of supporting armour. Every blown bridge cost hours or required detours that added miles and burned fuel. German planning had assumed some bridges would fall intact. The assumption was disastrously wrong. American engineers demolished bridges with professional efficiency, and each explosion sent shockwaves through the German timetable. 5th Panzer Army's advance illustrated the cascading failure. General von Manteuffel had planned for his armoured divisions to advance 25 miles on December 17th, reaching the outskirts of Bastogne and Street Vith. By nightfall, his lead elements had covered barely 8 miles. The problem was not American resistance. The defences were crumbling, but traffic. Infantry divisions, moving on foot or in trucks, clogged roads that panzer divisions needed. Artillery units, still horse-drawn in many German formations, created bottlenecks that armour could not bypass. Supply trucks attempting to deliver fuel and ammunition to forward units fought against the flow of combat vehicles moving west. Nobody had solved the basic problem. Too many units, too few roads, no way to coordinate movement in real time because radio communications were deliberately minimized to maintain surprise. Fuel consumption became critical far faster than planners anticipated. A Panther tank operating cross-country in winter conditions consumed approximately 5 gallons per mile. King Tiger tanks burned even more 7 gallons per mile under combat conditions. But fuel consumption did not pause when the tanks stopped moving. Engines had to remain running in winter weather to prevent freezing. Stationary tanks, waiting in traffic jams, consumed fuel at idle rates, approximately 1 gallon per hour. Multiply that by 1,400 armoured vehicles sitting motionless in traffic for hours at a time, and the fuel shortage became critical days ahead of schedule. By December 18th, forward panzer units were radio, ING headquarters with stark messages, fuel state critical, request immediate resupply. The fuel trucks could not reach them through the traffic chaos. December 18th, 1400 hours, near the village of Stavelot, Kampfgruppe Piper finally broke free from the traffic nightmare and advanced rapidly west, following backroads that bypassed American strongpoints. Piper's force reached the edge of an American supply depot containing over 2 million gallons of gasoline, enough fuel to reach Antwerp twice over. Piper could see the fuel storage tanks through his binoculars. His tanks were running on fumes, many with fuel gauges showing nearly empty. He prepared to assault the depot and capture the fuel intact. Then American engineers, who had remained at the depot specifically to prevent this scenario, detonated demolition charges. The explosion was visible from 10 miles away. 2 million gallons of high-octane gasoline erupted in a fireball that rose 3,000 feet into winter sky. Piper watched the fuel he desperately needed burn, knowing his offensive had just become significantly more difficult. His tanks would have to capture another fuel source, and quickly, or the advance would halt from simple logistical exhaustion. The traffic problem affected every level of the offensive. At the operational level, entire divisions fell behind schedule, creating gaps between units that should have been advancing in coordinated waves. At the tactical level, tank companies could not maneuver because they were trapped in road columns with no space to deploy. Support vehicles, repair units, medical teams, ammunition carriers could not reach forward elements because combat units blocked every route. The 12th SS Panzer Division, supposed to be the exploitation force that would follow Kampfgruppe Piper through the breakthrough, sat motionless for an entire day behind the 277th Volksgrenadier Division. By the time 12th SS reached its start line for the exploitation phase, Piper was already 40 miles ahead, isolated and desperate for support that would never arrive. Hitler's plan had assumed German forces would advance 50 miles per day. The actual rate of advance, calculated by measuring the distance between start positions and the deepest penetrations each day, averaged 5 miles per day for the first 3 days. The ratio revealed everything about why the offensive was failing strategically, even as it succeeded tactically. German forces were winning battles, shattering American units, capturing territory, but they were doing it at 1/10 the speed required to reach operational objectives before American reinforcements arrived. Every hour spent sitting in traffic was an hour Allied forces used to organize defenses, bring up reserves, establish blocking positions on the roads west. Speed was the only weapon Germany had against superior Allied numbers. The traffic jams destroyed that weapon. Staff officers in Model's headquarters tracked the widening gap between plan and reality with growing alarm. On paper, by December 18th, lead German units should have been approaching the Meuse River 50 miles from the start line. In reality, the deepest penetration Kampfgruppe paper had reached approximately 20 miles. Most units were 15 miles or less from their start positions. The arithmetic was merciless. At current rates of advance, German forces would reach the Meuse sometime in early January. By early January, American reinforcements, Patton's Third Army from the south, British reserves from the north, would have established impregnable defences. The offensive would culminate not at Antwerp but somewhere in the Belgian forests, having achieved nothing except catastrophic casualties and wasted resources. The traffic jams were not just frustrating delays, they were the operational death of the entire plan. And still the columns inched forward, engines running, fuel gauges dropping, commanders screaming into radios for movement that did not come. Drivers sat behind their wheels for hours, then moved 50 yards, then sat again. Tank crews, trained for mobile warfare and aggressive exploitation, found themselves helpless spectators in a traffic nightmare that no amount of tactical skill could solve. The Wehrmacht, famous for its blitzkrieg doctrine, was learning a lesson the Allies had learned on the bocage roads of Normandy. Modern mechanized warfare required not just capable soldiers and powerful weapons, but also logistics, infrastructure that could sustain tempo. Germany had the soldiers. Germany had the weapons. Germany did not have the roads, the fuel, or the time. The traffic jam to hell was teaching that lesson with brutal efficiency. December 17th, 1944, 1300 hours. Brigadier General Bruce Clark, Combat Command B, 7th Armoured Division, jumped from his jeep in the town square of Street. Viethen asked the first officer he saw a simple question: where is the front line? The captain, eyes hollow from 2 days without sleep, gestured vaguely east and replied, "Sir, you're standing on it." Clark had been ordered to Street, Vith, to reinforce what higher headquarters described as a minor penetration in the 106th Division sector. What he found instead was chaos incarnate, thousands of soldiers streaming west in disorganized retreat, abandoned vehicles clogging streets, and absolutely no coherent defensive line between German forces and the critical road junction behind him. 7 paved roads converged in Streetvith, making it the most strategically important location in the northern Ardennes. Whoever controlled Streetvith controlled movement across the entire region. Clark realized within minutes that he was not reinforcing a defensive line. He was going to have to create one from nothing. The situation was worse than anyone at higher headquarters understood. The 106th Infantry Division, which was supposed to be defending this sector, had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. 2 of its regiments, 7,000 men, were encircled on the Schnee Eifel, cut off and unable to retreat. The division's 3rd Regiment was scattered across 10 miles of forest, broken into company-sized groups trying to escape west. Division headquarters in Street, Vith had no communication with most of its subordinate units and only fragmentary understanding of where German forces actually were. Major General Alan Jones, the division commander, sat in his command post reviewing maps that showed positions from December 15th before the offensive began. The maps were worse than useless. They depicted a reality that no longer existed. Clark studied the chaos and made a decision that would save thousands of American lives. He would hold Streetvith long enough for the Allies to organize a coherent defense, even though holding was probably suicide. The 7th Armoured Division began arriving in Streetvith on December 17th, moving down from reserve positions in the Netherlands. These were veterans, men who had fought from Normandy through France, their Sherman tanks scarred from months of combat. They arrived expecting to find organized defensive positions and clear orders. Instead, they found roads clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers, German artillery already falling on the town's outskirts, and a situation so confused that nobody could tell them where the enemy actually was. Clark organized the chaos through sheer force of personality. He grabbed tank commanders as they arrived and sent them immediately to blocking positions east of town. He commandeered retreating infantry and artillery units, regardless of their parent organizations, and integrated them into a hasty defensive perimeter. By nightfall, December 17th, Clark had assembled approximately 11,000 men, a mix of armored infantry and artillery units from 6 different divisions, into something resembling a defensive line. The Germans needed Streetvith desperately. 5th Panzer Army's advance routes converged on the town from 3 directions. Without Streetvith, German columns would have to detour 20 miles north or south, adding days to the timeline and burning irreplaceable fuel. On December 18th, Field Marshal Model personally ordered the town's capture. Streetvith must fall today. The entire offensive depends on it. 3 German divisions, 18th Volksgrenadier, 62nd Volksgrenadier, and 9th SS Panzer, launched coordinated attacks against Clark's perimeter. The fighting was desperate and confused, often at ranges so close that American and German soldiers could hear each other shouting. Sherman tanks engaged Panther tanks in the forests around Streetvith at distances measured in dozens of yards rather than hundreds. American combat engineers, positioned at critical crossroads, laid hasty minefields that channeled German armor into kill zones where tank destroyers waited in ambush. December 19th brought the most critical moment. German forces broke through the northern perimeter and reached the outskirts of Streetvith itself. For 3 hours, the battle raged in the town's streets. American infantry fighting from buildings, while German tanks attempted to force their way through roadblocks. At one intersection, a single American tank destroyer, an M10, with a 3-inch gun, held off an entire German armored column by destroying the lead tank and blocking the street with burning wreckage. The crew fired 21 rounds, destroying or damaging 7 German vehicles, before a Panther tank killed them with a flank shot. That 3-hour delay, purchased with a 4-man crew's lives, allowed Clark to organize a counterattack that pushed German forces back out of the town. By nightfall, the perimeter still held, barely. The situation inside Streetvith was nightmarish. The town was under constant artillery fire, supplies were running low, ammunition, medical supplies, food, casualties mounted in aid stations, overwhelmed with wounded. Radio communications with higher headquarters were intermittent at best. Clark sent a message to Corps headquarters requesting permission to withdraw before the position became completely untenable. The reply came back, "Hold at all costs, Street. Fifth is vital." What Clark did not know, could not have known, was that his desperate defense was buying irreplaceable time. Every day Streetvith held was another day for the 82nd Airborne Division to establish blocking positions to the north, another day for reserves to reach Bastogne in the south, another day for Supreme Headquarters to organize a coordinated response. Clark was fighting a tactical battle that was determining strategic outcomes across the entire Ardennes front. December 21st brought a new horror-complete encirclement. German forces had finally bypassed Streetvith to the north and south, cutting the roads west. Clark's defense was now an isolated pocket, surrounded by 5 German divisions. Casualties had reduced his effective fighting strength to approximately 7,000 men. Ammunition was critically low, tank crews were rationed to 5 rounds per gun. Food was gone, except for emergency rations. The weather had turned bitterly cold, and wounded men were dying from exposure in buildings with no heat. Clark walked the perimeter that night, visiting positions, talking to soldiers who understood they might not survive the next day. A lieutenant asked him, "Sir, are we going to make it out of here?" Clark replied, "I don't know, but we're going to make the Germans pay for every yard." The defence of Streetvith entered its final phase on December 22nd. German artillery pounded the town continuously. Panzer attacks probed the perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously, trying to find weak points. American positions contracted hour by hour as casualties and ammunition shortages forced abandonment of outlying strongpoints. By December 23rd, Clark's perimeter had shrunk to a pocket barely 2 miles across. Higher headquarters finally authorized withdrawal, not because the position could be held any longer, but because the men had already achieved the impossible. They had delayed 5 German divisions for 7 days, buying time measured in blood and determination. That night, American forces evacuated Streetvith under cover of darkness, filtering through German lines in small groups, leaving behind equipment they could not carry and wounded they could not move. The cost was devastating. Of the 11,000 men who defended Street Vith, approximately 3,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. Clark's 7th Armored Division lost 30% of its tanks. The town itself was a burning ruin, demolished by artillery and fighting. But the strategic impact was incalculable. 5th Panzer Army's advance, which should have reached the Meuse River by December 18th, was still fighting for road junctions 20 miles from its start line. German divisions that should have been exploiting the breakthrough were instead besieging a pocket that refused to die. Model's headquarters calculated the delay. Street Vith's defense had cost the offensive 4 days minimum, possibly 5. In an operation planned around 72-hour timelines, 5 days was strategic catastrophe. The American soldiers who fought at Street Vith did not know they were winning. They were running out of ammunition, losing ground, dying in frozen foxholes. But by refusing to collapse, by trading time for blood, they were breaking the back of the German offensive's northern axis. December 24th, 1944, General Clark reached American lines west of Street Vith with remnants of his command. A staff officer from Corps headquarters met him with hot coffee and a message from the commanding general. "Well done, your defense of Street Vith may have saved the Ardennes front." Clark, who had not slept in 4 days, drank the coffee and said simply, "Tell the general to thank the soldiers, not me. They did the impossible." Behind him, Street Vith burned, occupied by German forces who had paid a catastrophic price for a town they no longer needed. The roads through Street Vith, choked with destroyed vehicles and rubble, would not support the rapid advance Model desperately needed. The shield of Street Vith had held just long enough. The German offensive was still advancing, still dangerous, but its momentum was broken. And in the forest south of Street Vith, in a town called Bastogne where 7 roads met, another group of American soldiers was preparing to do the same thing, refused to die when dying seemed inevitable. December 16th, 1944, 1300 hours. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces in Versailles, 400 miles from the Ardennes front, the morning staff meeting proceeded with routine efficiency. Intelligence officers presented their daily assessment. Limited enemy activity across all fronts. No significant developments. In the map room, pins marking Allied and German positions showed a front line that had not changed overnight. Nobody mentioned the Ardennes, because nothing important ever happened in the Ardennes. The sector was held by divisions resting after heavy combat, or by green divisions preparing for their first action. It was the quiet zone, the place where you sent troops who needed recovery time or training. While staff officers in Versailles discussed supply allocations and leave schedules 60 miles to the northeast, 1,400 German artillery pieces were preparing to fire. The most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in history was about to suffer its most catastrophic failure. The roots of the intelligence failure ran deep. Since June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, every assessment of German capabilities had proven correct or even conservative. The Wehrmacht was weaker than intelligence estimated, more disorganized, less capable of sustained resistance. This pattern created institutional confidence that hardened into certainty. Germany was defeated. The only question was timing. When intelligence officers reviewed reports from the Ardennes in early December, civilian sightings of German troop movements, forward observer reports of unusual activity, a German deserter claiming a massive attack was imminent, they filtered every piece of information through the lens of their expectations. Germany cannot launch a major offensive, therefore these reports must represent something else. Defensive preparations, local counterattacks, deception operations. The deserter was probably a plant. The civilians were mistaken. The forward observers were seeing routine troop rotations. Every report was explained away, rationalized, dismissed. Ultra intercepts, the secret intelligence derived from breaking German military codes, provided almost no warning. This fact mystified Allied intelligence officers after the war. How could the Germans hide an army of 30 divisions from the most successful code-breaking operation in history? The answer was operational discipline enforced with totalitarian efficiency. German commanders conducted the entire offensive planning through hand-delivered documents and face-to-face meetings. Radio traffic in the weeks before the attack remained routine, defensive, mundane. What few operational messages were transmitted used code words that Allied codebreakers had never encountered. Autumn fog for the attack plan, watch on the Rhine for the operation itself. Without context, These intercepts appeared to reference defensive preparations along the Rhine River. Ultra had not failed. German communications discipline had rendered it temporarily irrelevant. The Wehrmacht, learning from years of defeat, had adapted its operations to blind the intelligence system that had been reading its plans since 1942. On December 12th, a British intelligence officer named Major Brian Urquhart submitted a memo to 21st Army Group headquarters warning of possible German offensive action in the Ardennes. Urquhart had pieced together fragmentary evidence, aerial reconnaissance photographs showing possible supply buildups, signals intelligence suggesting unusual German command activity, reports from resistance networks in Belgium of troop movements through the Eifel region. His memo concluded, evidence suggests enemy may be contemplating limited offensive operations to disrupt Allied plans. The memo was filed and forgotten. Limited offensive operations were routine. The Germans had launched dozens of small counterattacks since Normandy. Nobody imagined anything larger. Urquhart's warning, one of the few accurate assessments produced before the attack, was buried under the weight of institutional certainty that Germany was incapable of strategic surprise. December 17th, 0900 hours. General Eisenhower sat in his Versailles office reviewing casualty reports from recent operations when his intelligence chief, Major General Kenneth Strong, entered with a folder of overnight reports from the Ardennes. Strong's face was pale. "Sir, we have a situation developing. The Germans attacked yesterday morning across a 60-mile front. Initial reports suggested local counterattacks. New information suggests this may be significantly larger." Eisenhower studied the map, his expression carefully neutral, then asked the question that would haunt Allied intelligence for years. "How did we miss this?" Strong had no answer. The Supreme Commander looked at the map again, calculating angles and distances, and said quietly, "Gentlemen, I think we have a major problem. That's no spoiling attack. They're going for Antwerp." The realization spread through Allied headquarters like ice water. If Eisenhower was correct, if this was a strategic offensive aimed at Antwerp, then 500,000 Allied troops were about to be cut off from their supplies. The implications were catastrophic. But even as senior commanders grasped the scale of the crisis, the intelligence system was still catching up to reality. Messages from forward units were confused and contradictory. Some reported heavy attacks. Others reported nothing unusual. Communications networks were overwhelmed with traffic, and fragmentary reports arrived hours after the events they described. Nobody knew how far German forces had penetrated, which American units still existed as coherent fighting forces, whether the defensive line was holding or had collapsed completely. Eisenhower was making strategic decisions based on information that was 12 hours old and probably wrong. December 18th, 1500 hours. Emergency conference at Verdun, France. Eisenhower assembled his top commanders, Bradley, Patton, Devers, to coordinate response to the German offensive. The mood was tense. Bradley, whose 12th Army Group was bearing the brunt of the attack, insisted the situation was containable with local reserves. Patton, commanding 3rd Army to the south, had already prepared contingency plans for pivoting north to strike the German flank. Eisenhower listened to his generals' debate, then made the decisions that would determine how the battle developed. First, halt all offensive operations across the entire front. Every division not currently engaged would shift to defensive positions. Second, Bradley would pull reserves from quiet sectors and send them to the Ardennes. Third, Patton would prepare 3rd Army to counterattack north within 72 hours. And fourth, the decision that would create political crisis later, Montgomery would assume command of all Allied forces north of the German breakthrough, giving the British field marshal authority over 2 American armies. The command decision was militarily sound but politically explosive. Bradley commanded 4 armies through 12th Army Group headquarters. The German offensive had split Bradley's command in 2. 1st and 9th Armies were north of the breakthrough, 3rd and 15th Armies were south. Communications between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and his northern armies were tenuous, routed through circuits that might be cut at any moment. Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters was north of the breakthrough, with reliable communications to 1st and 9th Armies. Putting Montgomery in charge of northern forces made operational sense. But it meant 2 American armies, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, would be commanded by a British field marshal who was already controversial for his cautious tactics and aristocratic demeanour. Bradley was furious but accepted the decision. Patton was disgusted but focused on preparing his counterattack. The political consequences would detonate later. What Eisenhower and his commanders did not yet understand was how close they had come to complete catastrophe. If German forces had achieved their planned advance rates, if traffic jams and fuel shortages had not delayed the offensive, they would have reached the Meuse River by December 19th. No significant Allied forces were positioned to stop them. The bridges at Dinant and Namur were undefended. The roads to Antwerp were open. The entire Allied logistics network funneled through a single port that was about to be cut off. The intelligence failure had nearly cost the Allies the war. They were saved not by their own competence, but by German logistical incompetence. The Wehrmacht could not exploit the surprise they had achieved because they could not sustain the operational tempo required to capitalize on it. Allied intelligence missed the German buildup completely, but German logistics failed even more catastrophically than Allied intelligence had. December 19th, 2100 hours. Eisenhower made a phone call that would define the remaining weeks of the battle. He dialed Montgomery's headquarters and explained the command changes. Montgomery's response was characteristically confident. "I will tidy up the battlefield and restore the situation." The phrase "tidy up" would later infuriate American generals and nearly fracture the Anglo-American alliance. But in the moment, Eisenhower needed Montgomery's confidence and his troops. British XXX Corps, positioned in reserve northeast of the breakthrough, would deploy along the Meuse River as a backstop defence. If German forces broke through American lines and reached the river, they would face British armour and artillery in prepared positions. It was the last line of defence, the final barrier between the Wehrmacht and Antwerp. Eisenhower finished the call and returned to the map room, studying the pins that represented German penetrations. The fog of war was lifting slowly, revealing the scope of the crisis. Now came the harder part, organising a response fast enough to matter. The intelligence failure would be analysed for decades. How did the most sophisticated military intelligence system in history miss 30 German divisions assembling for attack? The answer was institutional overconfidence reinforced by recent success, combined with German operational discipline that neutralised Allied technical advantages. But the deeper lesson, one that military academies would teach for generations, was about the danger of believing what you want to believe. Allied intelligence officers wanted to believe Germany was defeated. They interpreted every piece of evidence through that lens. The truth that Germany retained enough strength for one final devastating blow contradicted their worldview, so they rejected it. The fog of war was not just lack of information, it was the human tendency to see what we expect rather than what exists. And in December 1944, that fog nearly cost the Allies everything they had fought for since Normandy. December 15th, 1944, 2200 hours. In a camouflage supply depot 5 miles behind the German front line, quartermaster officers completed their final inventory. The numbers were stark. 5 million gallons of fuel allocated for Operation Wacht am Rhein, distributed among 30 divisions and stored in hidden dumps throughout the Eifel forests. Captain Ernst Hoffmann, logistics officer for 5th Panzer Army, reviewed the calculations one final time and reached the same conclusion he'd reached every time before. The math did not work. His Panther tank consumed 5 gallons per mile cross-country, 7 gallons per mile in difficult terrain. The distance from the German border to Antwerp 250 miles. Simple multiplication, 1,750 gallons per tank for a one-way trip, with zero margin for combat operations, no allowance for getting lost, nothing held in reserve for tactical maneuvers. And that assumed capturing American fuel dumps intact, an assumption that seemed more like prayer than planning. Hoffmann closed his ledger and thought what he could not say aloud: "We are launching an offensive that will run out of fuel before it reaches its objective." Fuel was the Wehrmacht's blood in 1944, and Germany was hemorrhaging it. Allied bombing had systematically destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel production infrastructure. In January 1944, German refineries produced 316,000 barrels of fuel daily. By December, production had collapsed to 98,000 barrels daily, a 69% reduction in 11 months. Every drop of fuel had to be allocated with excruciating precision. The Luftwaffe received barely enough to train new pilots. The Eastern Front received minimum quantities to conduct defensive operations. The Western Front's defensive needs were stripped to nothing to stockpile fuel for the Ardennes Offensive. 5 million gallons sounded like an ocean until you divided it by the Wehrmacht's consumption rate. German armour in active operations consumed 900,000 gallons per day. The Ardennes fuel allocation would sustain offensive operations for approximately 5.5 days. The operation was planned to last 7 days minimum, probably longer. The shortfall was not a planning deficiency, it was accepted reality. The offensive would run dry before reaching Antwerp, and everyone involved knew it. The German plan therefore depended absolutely on capturing American fuel dumps. Intelligence estimated the Allies had stockpiled approximately 3 million gallons in the Ardennes region, distributed among dozens of supply depots supporting American divisions. If German spearheads could seize these dumps intact in the first 48 hours, they could refuel and continue the advance. This assumption drove operational planning. Kampfgruppe Piper's route was selected partially because it passed near major American fuel storage facilities. The entire offensive was designed around the premise that the enemy would obligingly allow Germany to capture the supplies needed to destroy them. It was not a plan. It was institutionalized, magical thinking, the product of a regime that had lost touch with military reality but retained enough organizational competence to execute elaborate operations doomed from conception. December 18th, 1944, 1400 hours. Kampfgruppe Piper approached the Belgian village of Stavelot, where American intelligence reported a major fuel depot. Piper's tanks were running on fumes, fuel gauges showing quarter full at best, some vehicles burning their reserve supplies. The depot contained 2 million gallons of gasoline and diesel, more than enough to fuel Piper's entire force to Antwerp and back. Piper deployed his lead company for assault, prepared to overwhelm whatever guards protected the facility. Then the sky turned orange and black. American combat engineers, specifically ordered to deny fuel to German forces, had detonated demolition charges throughout the storage area. 2 million gallons of high-octane fuel erupted in an explosion that created its own weather system, a mushroom cloud visible from 20 miles away. Hurricane-force winds that knocked soldiers off their feet, heat so intense it melted the paint on vehicles half a mile distant. Piper watched the fuel he desperately needed transform into a tower of fire 3,000 feet high. His operations officer quietly observed, "That was our margin. That was the fuel that gets us to the Meuse." Piper said nothing, staring at the inferno, understanding that the offensive had just become exponentially more difficult. The fuel crisis manifested differently across the front. 2nd Panzer Division, advancing through the center of the German assault, ran critically low on fuel just 5 miles short of Bastogne on December 20th. Battalion commanders radioed requests for emergency resupply. The fuel trucks could not reach them. American resistance at Bastogne had cut the division's supply lines, and the traffic jams behind the front meant resupply vehicles were stuck 40 miles east, unable to push forward through the chaos. 2nd Panzer's tanks sat motionless for 18 hours while desperate staff officers tried to locate fuel anywhere in the division's operational area. They finally discovered a fuel dump belonging to a neighboring division and borrowed enough diesel to resume operations. Military bureaucracy breaking down under operational necessity. But the 18-hour delay meant 2nd Panzer missed its opportunity to encircle Bastogne before the 101st Airborne arrived. Fuel shortage had dictated tactical outcome. By December 21st, German forces across the entire Ardennes front were conducting fuel discipline measures that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. Tank crews were ordered to shut down engines whenever stationary, despite winter cold that made cold-starting diesel engines a nightmare. Units siphoned fuel from damaged vehicles before abandoning them. Artillery batteries ceased fire missions to conserve fuel for prime movers. Reconnaissance battalions, which should have been probing ahead of the main force, remained static because they had no fuel for their armoured cars. The Wehrmacht was cannibalizing itself, robbing rear area units to keep combat formations moving, and still the fuel gauges dropped. Implacable mathematics, grinding down the offensive's momentum more effectively than any American defensive action. December 23rd, 1944, near Celles, Belgium. 2nd Panzer Division, the deepest German penetration of the entire offensive, reached its final position 4 miles short of the Meuse River. They could see the river valley from their forward positions. They could practically walk to the bridge at Dinant, but their tanks had no fuel. Not low fuel, no fuel. Completely dry. Crews abandoned their vehicles and fought as infantry, knowing the tanks they'd relied on for mobility and firepower were now just 30-ton steel coffins. American forces, bringing up reserves and armour, encircled the position over the next 48 hours. 2nd Panzer Division was destroyed in place, not defeated in combat, but simply left to die by logistics that could not sustain what tactics had achieved. The division that came closest to success, that almost reached the Meuse, that nearly accomplished what Hitler demanded, was killed by fuel starvation within sight of its objective. Post-war analysis would calculate the exact dimensions of the fuel failure. German forces in the Ardennes Offensive covered approximately 40 miles before fuel shortages began limiting operations. They covered another 20 miles through desperate improvisation and captured supplies. At approximately 60 miles from the start line, most formations were combat ineffective due to fuel exhaustion. The Meuse River crossings, the critical operational objective, were 75 to 80 miles from German starting positions. The gap between what Germany could achieve and what Germany needed to achieve was 15 to 20 miles, a distance that might as well have been 1,500. No amount of tactical brilliance, operational skill, or soldier courage could close that gap. Physics dictated the outcome. Mathematics killed the offensive more surely than bullets. The fuel crisis also killed German options for strategic adjustment. When it became clear the offensive could not reach Antwerp, Model and von Manteuffel proposed converting the operation into a smaller encirclement, the small solution that Model had originally suggested. Trap American forces in the Ardennes, destroy several divisions, then withdraw and use the remaining fuel to establish defences along the Rhine. Hitler refused. Antwerp or nothing. Continue the attack until fuel exhaustion or victory. By December 24th, fuel exhaustion was the only possible outcome. German forces across the entire front were stationary, not because American resistance had stopped them, but because they had no fuel to continue. The offensive had not been defeated, it had simply run out of blood. The Wehrmacht was like a wounded animal that had crawled 60 miles before collapsing, still dangerous but incapable of further advance. On Christmas Day, 1944, as German soldiers celebrated a holiday they knew might be their last, quartermasters throughout the Ardennes compiled final fuel status reports. The numbers were catastrophic. Of the 5 million gallons allocated for the offensive, 4.7 million had been consumed. Captured American fuel totaled less than 100,000 gallons. The demolition program had worked almost perfectly. Remaining German fuel would sustain defensive operations for perhaps 3 days. Offensive operations were mathematically impossible. The blood of the Wehrmacht had been drained. The offensive was over in all but official acknowledgement. And in the frozen forests of Belgium, thousands of German tanks and armoured vehicles sat motionless, lethal weapons rendered harmless by empty fuel tanks, the most powerful symbols of why Germany was losing the war. Superior weapons meant nothing without the industrial capacity to sustain them. Tactical skill meant nothing without strategic resources to exploit it. The Ardennes offensive died, not with a bang, but with the quiet clicking of fuel gauges hitting empty. December 19th, 1944. 2200 hours. The convoy of trucks carrying the 101st Airborne Division into Bastogne rolled through darkness without headlights, drivers navigating by memory and desperation. In the lead truck, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe studied a map with a flashlight, trying to understand what exactly his division was driving into. The orders had been simple: move to Bastogne immediately, establish defences, hold at all costs. What those orders meant in practical terms was less clear. Radio reports described German forces advancing from multiple directions. Civilian refugees clogged the roads, fleeing west. American units were withdrawing through Bastogne in disorganized streams. McAuliffe had no idea where the front line was, which forces were friendly, or how long his division would have before the Germans arrived. The convoy reached Bastogne's outskirts at 23:30 hours. 30 minutes later, German forces closed the ring around the town. The 101st Airborne had arrived just in time to be trapped. Bastogne mattered for the same reason Street Vith mattered roads. 7 paved highways converged on the town, making it the strategic hub of the southern Ardennes. Control Bastogne, and you controlled movement across the entire region. Lose Bastogne and German forces would have to detour dozens of miles, burning fuel and losing time they could not afford. 5th Panzer Army desperately needed Bastogne. The American defence desperately needed to deny it. The battle that would develop over the next week, the siege that would make Bastogne synonymous with American courage, was therefore inevitable from the moment the German offensive began. Geography dictated that this town, this crossroads of nothing special, would become one of World War II's defining battles. The 101st Airborne was an elite formation paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought through France and Holland. They were supposed to be in reserve, resting and refitting after Operation Market Garden. When the Ardennes crisis erupted, they were loaded onto trucks and sent south with whatever equipment they could grab. Many soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms, no winter coats, no cold weather gear. Ammunition was short. Heavy weapons were left behind because there was no time to load them. The division arrived in Bastogne with essentially what soldiers carried on their backs. McAuliffe looked at his forces, 11,000 paratroopers, plus remnants of armoured and artillery units retreating through town, and calculated how long they could hold. The answer depended entirely on whether supplies could reach them, and whether American forces outside the encirclement could break through before the Germans overran the defences. December 20th, 1300 hours, German forces completed the encirclement. Bastogne was now an island, surrounded by elements of 5 German divisions. American supply lines were cut. The only communication with the outside world was radio, and German jamming made even that unreliable. McAuliffe organised his defences in a perimeter approximately 6 miles in circumference, anchored on the villages surrounding Bastogne, Foy, Bizori, Mont, Marvy. Each village became a strong point defended by a company of paratroopers, supported by whatever tanks and tank destroyers had been caught in the encirclement. The defenders dug foxholes in frozen ground, laid wire obstacles with numb fingers, and prepared to hold against forces that outnumbered them 5-1. A company commander asked McAuliffe, "Sir, what do we do if they hit us with everything?" McAuliffe replied, "Kill them all. We're not leaving." The German assault began December 21st with probing attacks designed to identify weak points in the American perimeter. Wehrmacht infantry, supported by artillery, struck the eastern defences near Bizori. The fighting was savage and close, Germans advancing through morning fog, Americans firing at shadows and sounds. One engagement epitomised the desperate nature of the defence. A platoon of paratroopers, reduced to 19 men after 3 days of fighting, held a road junction against an entire German battalion for 4 hours. They had no communications with higher headquarters, no idea if reinforcements were coming, no orders except to hold. When the position finally fell, 14 of the 19 Americans were dead. The remaining 5 retreated to the next position and kept fighting. This pattern repeated across the entire perimeter, small groups of American soldiers fighting against overwhelming odds, buying time measured in blood, refusing to break. December 22nd, 1100 hours, German emissaries approached American lines under flag of truce, carrying a surrender demand. The document, written in English, explained that Bastogne was surrounded, that resistance was futile, that the Americans had 2 hours to surrender or face annihilation. The message reached McAuliffe while he was reviewing casualty reports and ammunition status. Both were grim. His initial verbal response to the German demand was captured by his staff. Nuts. When asked what official reply to send, McAuliffe wrote exactly one word on the German document: nuts. The response confused the German officers who received it. They didn't understand the American colloquialism. A regimental commander explained, "It means go to hell." The message was delivered back to German lines. Within hours, German artillery resumed bombardment with renewed fury. McAuliffe's defiance had become legend even before the siege ended. The supply situation became critical on December 23rd. Ammunition was running low, artillery batteries were rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day, barely enough to break up German attacks. Food was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were critically short, and casualty clearing stations were overflowing with wounded men who couldn't be evacuated. Weather had prevented air resupplies since the siege began. Fog and clouds kept Allied aircraft grounded. Then, on December 23rd morning, the weather cleared. The sky turned brilliant blue, cloudless, perfect. Within 2 hours, C-47 transport aircraft began arriving over Bastogne, flying at low altitude through German anti-aircraft fire, dropping supplies by parachute. The sight of parachutes filling the sky, red and white and blue against winter clouds, broke the morale crisis that had been building in the perimeter. Soldiers cheered, officers wept. Over the next 48 hours, Allied aircraft dropped 105 tons of supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, food, even Christmas cards and mail from home. The supply drops didn't solve every problem, but they solved the critical one. Bastogne could continue fighting. December 24th, Christmas Eve. German forces launched their most powerful assault of the entire siege. 18 panzer tanks and 2 battalions of infantry struck the northwest perimeter at Champs, trying to break through to Bastogne itself. The fighting lasted 12 hours, much of it at point-blank range in darkness. American tank destroyers engaged German armour at ranges measured in yards. Bazookas fired into Panther tanks from second-story windows. At one critical point, The perimeter broke. German tanks penetrated 500 yards into American positions before a desperate counterattack by reserve companies restored the line. By midnight, the German assault had been stopped, but barely. The cost was horrific: 30% casualties in the defending battalion, 11 American armored vehicles destroyed, ammunition expenditure so heavy that some positions were down to single-digit rounds per weapon. McAuliffe walked the perimeter after the battle, stepping over bodies, American and German mixed together in the darkness, and understood that another assault like this would break the defense. Bastogne was holding, but it was hanging by a thread. The relief column that would save Bastogne was already moving north. General George Patton's Third Army had executed the most remarkable maneuver of the entire war: 90-degree pivot of 250,000 men in 72 hours, from offensive operations south of the Ardennes to counterattack operations striking north toward Bastogne. 4th Armoured Division led the advance, fighting through German defences that understood exactly what was happening and were desperate to prevent the link-up. The final miles to Bastogne cost 4th Armoured 30% of its tanks and 1,400 men. But on December 26th, at 16:45 hours, the lead tank of 4th Armoured's 37th Tank Battalion broke through the German encirclement and made contact with defenders on the southern perimeter. The siege of Bastogne was broken after 7 days of isolation. The battle was not over. German forces would continue attacking Bastogne for weeks, trying to cut the corridor that 4th Armoured had opened. But the crisis had passed. The 101st Airborne had held when holding seemed impossible. They had denied German forces the road network they desperately needed. They had consumed 5 German divisions in a siege that achieved nothing except proving American forces could not be intimidated into surrender. The cost was severe: 2,000 casualties in the 101st alone, plus thousands more in the armoured and infantry units that defended alongside them. But Bastogne had held, and in holding, it had broken the timetable of the German offensive as surely as Streetvith had broken it to the north. The German plan required speed. Every day spent besieging Bastogne was a day American reserves moved into position, a day German fuel gauges dropped closer to empty, a day closer to inevitable defeat. McAuliffe's one-word reply, "nuts," became the perfect encapsulation of American response to the entire Ardennes offensive. Defiance in the face of overwhelming odds, refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. Bastogne held because surrender was never an option. That simple fact, multiplied across thousands of American soldiers in dozens of desperate fights, was why Germany's last great offensive was failing. December 20th, 1944, 0900 hours. British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stepped from his Rolls-Royce staff car at 1st Army headquarters in Chaudefontaine, Belgium, and surveyed the scene with undisguised displeasure. American staff officers rushed past carrying map cases and status reports, their faces showing strain and exhaustion. The headquarters had the feel of controlled chaos, orders being issued, units being moved, desperate attempts to organize coherent defense from fragmentary information. Montgomery straightened his beret, adjusted his trademark 2-badge insignia, and entered the command post where Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, 1st Army commander, waited. Montgomery's first words would be remembered and resented for decades: "I've come to tidy up the battlefield." The phrase was vintage Montgomery, confident to the point of arrogance, dismissive of American competence, accurate in military assessment but catastrophic in political impact. In that single sentence, Montgomery encapsulated everything American generals loathed about working with their British ally. Eisenhower's decision to give Montgomery command of all Allied forces north of the German breakthrough was militarily sound but politically radioactive. The German offensive had split Bradley's 12th Army Group in two. 1st and 9th Armies were north of the Bulge, 3rd and 15th Armies were south. Communications between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and his northern armies ran through circuits that German advances threatened to cut at any moment. Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters was north of the breakthrough, with secure communications to 1st and 9th Armies. The command change made operational sense. Montgomery could coordinate northern forces faster and more effectively than Bradley could from Luxembourg. But it meant approximately 220,000 American soldiers would be commanded by a British officer who many Americans considered overcautious, publicity-seeking, and condescending. The decision would save the northern shoulder of the Ardennes battle. It would also nearly destroy the Anglo-American alliance. Montgomery arrived at First Army headquarters with clear plans and absolute confidence. He immediately ordered withdrawal from exposed positions to create a more defensible line, standard British military doctrine emphasizing consolidation over holding every yard of ground. American officers trained to counterattack and seize initiative found this approach defeatist. Montgomery insisted, "We must establish a firm shoulder, then counterattack from strength." Holding scattered positions invites defeat in detail. He repositioned reserves, established blocking positions along likely German advance routes, and brought British XXX Corps forward as backstop along the Meuse River. These were sound tactical decisions that probably prevented German breakthrough to the river. But Montgomery's manner, the impression that British professionalism was cleaning up American mistakes, infuriated the officers whose troops were doing the actual fighting and dying. December 21st. Montgomery visited forward positions, talking with American commanders, assessing their capabilities and morale. What he found impressed him despite his prejudices. American soldiers were fighting tenaciously, despite being surprised, outnumbered, and in many cases surrounded. Junior officers showed initiative and courage that matched anything Montgomery had seen in British forces. But the command structure was chaotic. Units were scattered and mixed together, without regard for organisational boundaries, and nobody seemed certain where German forces actually were. Montgomery began issuing orders that restored organisational coherence. Units were sorted back into their parent divisions. Clear boundaries were established between different formations. Reserve positions were designated where units could rally if forced to withdraw. The Americans resented being told what to do, but Montgomery's organisational skill was precisely what the crisis required. The northern shoulder of the German offensive, the sector where 6th SS Panzer Army was supposed to achieve the main breakthrough, became Montgomery's focus. American forces from V Corps and the 82nd Airborne Division held a line from Monschau south to the Amblève River, blocking German attempts to widen the breach. If this shoulder collapsed, German forces would have open roads northwest toward Liège and the Meuse. Montgomery reinforced the shoulder with everything available. British tanks moved into reserve positions, artillery batteries registered defensive fires, engineers prepared demolitions on every bridge. On December 23rd, when German forces launched a major assault trying to break through at Malmedy, they ran into defensive positions that Montgomery had personally supervised. The attack was stopped cold. The northern shoulder held, and Montgomery took credit for it in ways that made American commanders seethe. British XXX Corps deployed along the Meuse River on December 22nd, taking positions from Givet north to Liège. This was the final defensive line, the last barrier between German forces and their objective. If American defences collapsed completely, if German armour broke through and reached the Meuse, British forces would be all that stood between the Wehrmacht and Antwerp. The 29th Armoured Brigade, equipped with Sherman tanks and Churchill tanks, established positions covering the key crossing points. Engineers prepared to demolish bridges if German forces approached. Artillery registered on approach routes. Montgomery inspected these positions personally, ensuring they met his exacting standards. The deployment was precautionary. Montgomery did not expect German forces to reach the Meuse, but if they did, British forces would stop them. The deployment gave Eisenhower strategic insurance at a moment when insurance seemed desperately necessary. The political crisis erupted on January 7, 1945, after the immediate military crisis had passed. Montgomery held a press conference at which he discussed the Ardennes battle and his role in Allied response. His statements, intended to praise American soldiers while explaining British contributions, instead ignited a diplomatic firestorm. Montgomery described how he took certain steps to ensure coherent defence, how British troops were brought in to save the day, how he had employed the whole available power of the British group of armies to rescue the situation. The phrasing implied British forces had saved Americans from defeat, an interpretation newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic seized upon. American press exploded with fury. British press crowed about Montgomery's brilliance. The alliance Eisenhower had carefully nurtured for 2 years threatened to fracture over wounded pride and cultural misunderstanding. General Omar Bradley, who had lost command of 2 armies to Montgomery and endured weeks of British oversight, reached his breaking point. He told Eisenhower in a private meeting, "I cannot serve under Montgomery. If political forces dictate his continued command of American troops, then I must resign." Bradley was not bluffing. Patton, never one for diplomatic restraint, publicly declared he would rather work for a German general than Montgomery. The crisis escalated to Churchill and Roosevelt. The British Prime Minister, recognising the damage Montgomery's statements had caused, addressed Parliament on January 18th with carefully prepared remarks. The Battle of the Bulge is the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. Churchill's intervention prevented total rupture, but the damage to Anglo-American military relations was profound and permanent. What got lost in the political recriminations was the military reality. Montgomery's command of northern forces probably prevented disaster. His consolidation of defences, positioning of reserves, and establishment of the Meuse backstop were exactly what the situation required. American casualties in the northern sector were significantly lower than in southern sectors where no such systematic reorganisation occurred. German forces never seriously threatened the Meuse crossings in the north, partially because Montgomery's defences made such attempts suicidal. The Field Marshal's sin was not his military decisions but his public relations, the inability to credit American soldiers properly while explaining British contributions. Montgomery could not help himself. He had to be the hero of every battle, the genius who rescued lesser commanders from their mistakes. That compulsion, that need for recognition, poisoned what should have been acknowledged as effective Allied cooperation. December 28, 1944. Montgomery stood at an observation post overlooking the northern Ardennes, watching American troops advance against retreating German forces. The crisis was over. The German offensive had been contained and was being pushed back. British forces had played their role, providing depth and backstop that gave American defenders confidence to hold forward positions. Montgomery wrote in his diary that night, "The battle has been won through proper coordination of Allied forces under unified command." He was right, but he could never say it without making it sound like his personal triumph. And that inability, that fundamental failure to understand how his words would be received, ensured that Montgomery's positive contributions to the Ardennes battle would be overshadowed by the political damage his arrogance caused. The lessons for alliance warfare were profound and would shape NATO doctrine for generations. Command unity was essential. Eisenhower's decision to place Montgomery in charge of northern forces, however politically costly, was militarily correct. National pride could not be allowed to dictate operational decisions. But equally important was the human dimension. Allies needed to feel respected, their contributions acknowledged, their sacrifices honoured. Montgomery failed that test catastrophically. His tactical skill could not compensate for his diplomatic incompetence. The Ardennes battle taught American and British armies how to fight together under crisis. It also taught them how easily alliance warfare could be poisoned by personality conflicts and cultural misunderstandings. Those lessons would echo through every Allied operation for the rest of the war and beyond. Montgomery had saved the northern shoulder of the Ardennes front, but he had nearly destroyed the alliance in the process. That paradox, brilliant military judgment, coupled with disastrous political instinct, defined his entire career and his entire legacy. December 17th, 1944, 0400 hours. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper stood in the cupola of his command tank, watching his Kampfgruppe prepare for the assault that would carry them deeper into American rear areas than any German force would penetrate during the entire offensive. Behind him, 4,800 men and 600 vehicles waited in the darkness. King Tiger tanks with 88mm guns, Panther tanks, armoured half-tracks carrying SS Panzer Grenadiers, reconnaissance vehicles, engineers, artillery. This was the spearhead of 6th SS Panzer Army, the formation Hitler personally selected to lead the drive to the Meuse. Peiper was 30 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had earned a reputation for tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. His orders were explicit: break through American lines at any cost, ignore resistance unless it directly blocked the route, reach the Meuse River crossings in 48 hours, refuel from captured American supplies, and drive to Antwerp. Speed was everything. Hesitation meant death. Peiper lit a cigarette and waited for dawn. The route assigned to Kampfgruppe Peiper was designated Rollbahn D, Route D, a narrow road network that wound through the northern Ardennes toward the Meuse crossing at Huy. The road was barely adequate for the tanks that would use it. King Tigers weighed 69 tons each and measured 24 feet long. The roads through the Ardennes averaged 18 feet wide. There was no margin for error, no room to manoeuvre if the route was blocked. Piper's mission depended on capturing bridges intact before American engineers could demolish them, maintaining momentum regardless of resistance, and ruthlessly bypassing any strong point that could not be overrun immediately. It was blitzkrieg distilled to its purest essence, pure speed and violence, tactics designed to create paralysis and panic in the enemy's rear area. For 2 days, it would work brilliantly. Then geography and logistics would destroy what tactics had achieved. December 17th, 0600 hours. Kampfgruppe Piper attacked through the Lochheim Gap, following behind the infantry that had broken American front lines during the previous day's assault. The advance was initially slower than planned. Traffic jams from the infantry divisions clogged the roads, and Piper's tanks sat motionless for hours, waiting for routes to clear. At 0900, Piper made a decision that defined his entire operation. He would leave the assigned route and use back roads and farm tracks to bypass the traffic. It was tactically brilliant and logistically suicidal. The back roads were not on German maps. They were not reinforced for heavy vehicles. They passed through villages where American forces might still be present, but they were empty of traffic, and speed was all that mattered. Piper's column left Rollbahn D and plunged into the Ardennes forests on roads that sometimes barely existed. By 1300 hours, December 17th, Kampfgruppe Piper had penetrated 20 miles behind American lines, far deeper than any other German unit. They overran American supply dumps, rear area headquarters, truck convoys, whose drivers did not realize the front line had collapsed. At Honsfeld, a small village where American troops were billeted, Piper's column attacked at dawn, killing or capturing 300 soldiers in 15 minutes. The Germans captured 50 American vehicles, trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and more importantly, captured fuel. Piper's tanks refueled from American supplies, the first and only time this critical assumption of the German plan actually worked. Loaded with captured fuel and confidence, Kampfgruppe Piper drove west, leaving destruction in their wake and terror in American rear areas. Reports reached American headquarters describing German armor appearing from nowhere, smashing through positions, disappearing into forests before any response could be organized. The psychological impact was devastating. The rear area, supposedly safe, was suddenly the most dangerous place on the battlefield. December 17th, 1300 hours, near Borgnes Crossroads, called Malmedy by the Americans, who would remember this location forever. Kampfgruppe Piper's advance guard encountered Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, unarmed American troops in unarmored vehicles, headquarters personnel and forward observers who had no chance against Panzer Grenadiers. The Americans surrendered immediately, approximately 130 men. They were disarmed, assembled in a field beside the road, and machine-gunned. 84 Americans died in the snow at Malmedy. Another 30 escaped by playing dead or running into nearby woods. The massacre was deliberate, ordered by officers who considered American prisoners an impediment to rapid advance. News of the massacre spread through American forces within hours, transmitted by survivors and by civilians who witnessed the atrocity. The effect was incalculable. American soldiers stopped surrendering. Even surrounded, even hopeless, they would fight rather than trust German promises of proper treatment. Piper's ruthlessness achieved the opposite of its intention. Instead of terrorizing Americans into submission, it hardened resistance to fanatical levels. The advance continued. December 18th, Kampfgruppe Piper reached Stavelot on the Amblev River. The bridge was intact, lightly defended. Piper's lead tanks seized it before American engineers could demolish the span. Beyond Stavelot lay the road to the Meuse, open and undefended. But dawn was breaking, and Piper made a fateful decision. He would pause for 6 hours to allow his column to consolidate, refuel, and prepare for the final dash to the river. Those 6 hours gave American forces time to react. By afternoon, when Piper resumed his advance, American engineers had demolished bridges on his route and established blocking positions with whatever forces they could scrape together: tank destroyers, infantry stragglers, headquarters personnel armed with bazookas. The window of opportunity was closing. December 19th, Kampfgruppe Piper reached Staumont, a village in a narrow valley where the road passed between steep hillsides. American forces had established a defensive position there: tanks from the 3rd Armoured Division, infantry from the 82nd Airborne, tank destroyers positioned on the heights overlooking the road. When Piper's King Tigers advanced through the valley, they entered a kill zone. American tank destroyers with 3-inch guns fired from positions 200 feet above the road, hitting the thinly armored roofs of German tanks. Panthers exploded. King Tigers through tracks trying to maneuver in the narrow space. For 6 hours, the battle raged in Staumont streets, some combat at ranges so close that German and American soldiers could hear each other breathing. Piper lost 25% of his armor in a single engagement. By nightfall, the advance had been stopped. The American defenders, outnumbered, outgunned, fighting in a desperate improvised defense, had achieved what no other American force had managed. They had stopped Piper's spearhead cold. December 20th through 23rd, Kampfgruppe Piper found itself trapped in a pocket near the village of L'Église. American forces surrounded the position, closing roads, establishing artillery positions, bringing up tanks and infantry to methodically reduce the pocket. Piper's situation deteriorated hour by hour. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Fuel was gone. Tanks sat motionless, unable to move. Food was depleted. Wounded men filled every building in the village, and there were no medical supplies to treat them. Piper radioed for relief, for resupply, for air support. Nothing came. The rest of 6th SS Panzer Army was stuck in traffic jams 40 miles east. The Luftwaffe had no fuel for supply flights. Piper and his men were alone, surrounded, slowly dying in a Belgian village they could not leave and could not defend. December 24th, 0200 hours, Piper made the hardest decision of his military career: abandon everything and escape on foot. His 800 surviving soldiers destroyed their weapons, disabled their vehicles, and infiltrated through American lines in small groups during darkness. They left behind 135 vehicles, King Tigers, Panthers, half-tracks, trucks sitting in L'Église as monuments to failure. Piper reached German lines on December 26th with fewer than 800 of the 4,800 men who had begun the operation. Kampfgruppe Piper had achieved the deepest penetration of the entire offensive, 35 miles behind American lines, closer to the Meuse than any other German force, and it had accomplished exactly nothing. The vehicles were lost, the men were dead or captured. The fuel consumed getting 35 miles could have been used to support operations that might have achieved something meaningful. Piper's spearhead was a tactical success that exemplified strategic failure. Post-war analysis would debate Piper's decisions endlessly. Should he have bypassed Stavelot's fuel depot and driven directly for the Meuse? Should he have bypassed Staumont rather than fighting for the road? Should he have retreated earlier, saving his force to fight another day? The debates missed the fundamental point. Piper failed because the entire operation was impossible. No amount of tactical brilliance could compensate for insufficient fuel, inadequate logistics, and a strategic plan that required everything to go perfectly. Piper drove deeper than anyone else because he was more ruthless than anyone else, but ruthlessness could not change mathematics. His tanks ran out of fuel because Germany did not have enough fuel. His relief column never arrived because German roads could not support the traffic. His escape succeeded because even surrounded and defeated, elite soldiers could improvise and survive. But survival was not victory. Kampfgruppe Piper's story was the story of the entire Ardennes Offensive, in miniature, brilliant tactical execution that achieved nothing, casualties that could not be replaced, and bitter proof that Germany had lost the capacity for strategic success. Piper would stand trial at Dachau in 1946 for the Malmedy massacre and other atrocities committed during the Ardennes Offensive. He was convicted and sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment, eventually released in 1956. He would be murdered by unknown assailants in France in 1976, retribution finally catching up decades after his crimes. But in December 1944, as his force died in the forests around L'Église, Piper understood what many German commanders were beginning to understand. The war was lost, the offensive had failed, and all that remained was choosing how to face inevitable defeat. Some would choose honor. Piper had chosen ruthlessness and massacre, and in the end, neither choice changed the outcome. The spearhead had broken, the offensive was doomed. December 19th, 1944, 1100 hours, General George Smith, Patton Jr., commanding Third Army, stood before Eisenhower in the conference room at Verdun and did something that would define his legend forever. He promised the impossible and delivered it. Eisenhower had summoned his commanders to coordinate response to the German offensive. Bradley was cautious, suggesting defensive operations and gradual buildup of forces. Montgomery was absent, already commanding northern forces. Patton listened to the discussion for exactly 5 minutes before interrupting. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went silent. Bradley stared. Eisenhower studied Patton's face, looking for the bravado and exaggeration that characterized the man. What he saw instead was absolute confidence. Patton was not boasting, he was stating fact. His staff had already prepared contingency plans. His divisions were already receiving movement orders. He could pivot Third Army 90 degrees from offensive operations east toward Germany to counterattack operations north toward Bastogne in 72 hours. It was the most audacious logistical promise of the entire war, and Patton would keep it. The maneuver Patton proposed was staggering in scope and complexity. Third Army consisted of approximately 250,000 men, 133,000 vehicles, deployed across a 100-mile front east of the Ardennes. Patton intended to disengage from current operations, turn 90 degrees left, move 75 miles north, and attack into the southern flank of the German Bulge, all in 3 days. Military textbooks said such a maneuver required 2 weeks minimum. Armies could not pivot on command like company-sized units. Logistics trains needed time to reorient. Units needed rest after combat before undertaking new operations. Every staff officer in Verdun knew this. Patton knew it too and did not care. He had already positioned his staff officers along the roads Third Army would use. He had pre-positioned fuel dumps. He had alerted his division commanders that movement orders were coming. When Eisenhower approved the operation, Patton simply implemented plans he had been developing for days. December 21st, 0300 hours, the movement began. Third Army columns rolled north through winter darkness, driving without headlights on icy roads, navigating by memory and compass bearing. The scale was unprecedented. 133,178 vehicles moving simultaneously from half-tracks to tanks to supply trucks to artillery tractors. Traffic control was nightmare logistics made real. Military police stood at every crossroads, directing units, preventing collisions, keeping the massive flowing north. Patton positioned himself at a critical intersection and personally directed traffic for 6 hours, sending units north with encouragement and profanity in equal measure. A lieutenant, recognizing the 3 stars, asked, "General, shouldn't you be at headquarters?" Patton replied, "I should be wherever I'm needed. Right now, I'm needed here. Drive faster." The weather was miserable snow, freezing rain, roads that became ice rinks under the weight of tank treads. Vehicles slid off roads. Drivers fought to maintain formation in conditions that made visibility nearly zero. Accidents were inevitable and continuous. Yet the movement continued, hour after hour, day after day, a rolling tide of American armor and infantry flowing north toward the sound of guns. Patton's operations officer calculated they were moving faster than Third Army had advanced during the pursuit across France, except now they were not advancing into empty territory, but repositioning under combat conditions while German forces were still fighting on their flanks. The logistical achievement was stunning. Staff officers at Shaif headquarters, tracking Third Army's movement on situation maps, could barely believe what they were seeing. Patton was actually doing it. The promise was being kept. December 22nd, 1400 hours. Lead elements of 4th Armoured Division, Third Army's spearhead, made contact with German forces south of Bastogne. The attack axis was narrow, a 20-mile corridor from Arlon north to the surrounded town. German forces, aware that relief was coming, established defensive positions across every road, every village, every defensible terrain feature. The fighting was brutal. 4th Armoured advanced, not in miles but in hundreds of yards, purchased with tanks and blood. Every village was a battle. Every road junction was defended. German artillery, knowing exactly where American forces had to attack, registered defensive fires that turned approach routes into killing zones. Patton watched the casualty reports arrive and made no concessions to the cost. Attack, attack, attack. Speed was life. Hesitation was death. Break through to Bastogne or die trying. December 23rd brought the weather break that transformed the battle. For 7 days, fog and clouds had grounded Allied aircraft and protected German forces from air attack. On December 23rd, the skies cleared to brilliant blue, cloudless, perfect. Patton looked at the sky and said to his chaplain, "Chaplain, you sure must have a great influence with the Almighty." That was some prayer. The chaplain had written a weather prayer at Patton's request days earlier, asking God to clear the skies so Allied air power could strike. Now those skies, filled with Allied aircraft P-40, 7 Thunderbolts carrying bombs and rockets, medium bombers striking German supply routes, transport aircraft dropping supplies to Bastogne, the air support was devastating and immediate. Fighter bombers attacked German positions directly in front of 4th Armoured's advance, destroying tanks, killing infantry, shattering defensive lines. What had been grinding advance became breakthrough operation. The final push to Bastogne began December 26th, 0600 hours. 4th Armoured Division attacked with everything remaining, 60 tanks, 3 infantry battalions, artillery support from every gun within range. German defenders fought with desperation, knowing that if the corridor opened, the entire southern flank of the German offensive would be exposed to counterattack. The fighting was savage. 4th Armoured's 37th Tank Battalion lost 30% of its tanks in 6 hours. Infantry companies were reduced to half strength, but the advance continued, yard by yard, house by house, road junction by road junction. At 1600 hours, Captain William Dwight, commanding the lead tank company, radioed, "We're in Bastogne, resistance light." Mission accomplished. 4th Armoured had broken the siege. Patton's promise was kept. The cost of Patton's operation was severe. 4th Armoured Division alone suffered 1,400 casualties and lost 40 tanks in 6 days of combat. Other 3rd Army divisions engaged in supporting attacks suffered similar losses, but the strategic impact was decisive. The relief of Bastogne transformed the Ardennes battle from defensive crisis to counter-offensive opportunity. German forces besieging Bastogne, 5 divisions, were now exposed to attack from the south while still fighting encircled American defenders. The road network Germans desperately needed remained in American hands, and Patton's 3rd Army, now fully deployed along the southern flank of the German Bulge, was positioned to launch the counterattack that would drive German forces back to their start lines. December 30th, 1944, Patton met with McAuliffe in Bastogne, touring the positions that had been held under siege. He saw the foxholes dug in frozen ground, the aid stations filled with wounded, the shell craters and destroyed vehicles that marked where desperate fighting had occurred. McAuliffe showed Patton the one-word reply to the German surrender demand: nuts. Patton laughed and said, "That's the spirit I want in every American soldier. Surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and your response is telling the enemy to go to hell." The two generals discussed the next phase, expanding the corridor, driving German forces north, eventually linking up with forces attacking south from the northern shoulder. The defensive battle was over, the counteroffensive had begun, and 3rd Army, which had promised the impossible, was positioned to finish what the Germans had started. The 90-degree pivot of 3rd Army became legend, studied in military academies for generations as the gold standard for rapid redeployment under combat conditions. Patton's achievement was not just logistical, though the logistics were staggering, but psychological. He convinced his troops they could do the impossible, and through sheer force of personality and meticulous planning, he made it happen. Critics would argue Patton's attacks were costly. That more cautious approach would have saved lives. Patton's response was always the same. Speed saves more lives than caution. Attack aggressively and end the war faster. Hesitate and the war drags on. Casualties mount. Soldiers die. In the Ardennes, Patton's philosophy was proven correct. His rapid counterattack broke the German offensive's southern flank, relieved Bastogne, and began the process of pushing German forces back across the border. The promise made on December 19th was kept on December 26th, and 3rd Army, through snow and blood and determination, had delivered the impossible exactly when it was needed most. December 23rd, 1944, 0900 hours, RAF Lakenheath, England. Wing Commander James "Johnny" Johnson walked across the frozen tarmac toward his Hawker Tempest fighter, breathing vapor clouds in the bitter cold. For 7 days, he and every other Allied pilot in Europe had been grounded by weather that turned airfields into mud and shrouded the Ardennes in impenetrable fog. The meteorological reports that morning showed what everyone had been praying for. High-pressure system moving in, skies clearing across Belgium and France, visibility unlimited. Johnson climbed into his cockpit and received the briefing that would be repeated at every Allied airfield from England to eastern France. Maximum effort, every available aircraft, anything German moving in the Ardennes. No restrictions on ordnance expenditure. This is total war, gentlemen. Make it count. Within 2 hours, the largest single-day air operation of the European war would be underway. The thunder from above was about to transform the battlefield. The weather that had protected German forces for the first week of the offensive was both blessing and curse. Fog and low clouds prevented Allied aircraft from attacking exposed German columns, allowing the Wehrmacht to move during daylight without facing the fighter-bomber attacks that had decimated German forces during the summer campaigns in France. But the same weather grounded the Luftwaffe, preventing German air support for ground operations and eliminating any chance of protecting supply convoys. When the weather cleared on December 23rd, the advantage shifted catastrophically. Allied air forces based in England, France, Belgium, and Holland could put 5,000 aircraft over the battlefield. Germany's Luftwaffe, decimated by years of attrition and fuel shortages, could muster perhaps 400 fighters. The ratio was 12-1. When those numbers materialized in the skies over the Ardennes, German forces experienced what Allied troops had suffered in Normandy, total air supremacy that turned every movement into potential death sentence. The first sorties launched at 0930, P-47 Thunderbolts from the 9th Air Force, each carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs and 850 caliber machine guns, swept across the Ardennes at low altitude looking for targets. They found them everywhere: German columns on roads, tanks moving through villages, supply trucks struggling through traffic jams, artillery batteries in firing positions. The Thunderbolts attacked in diving passes, dropping bombs from 500 feet, then circling back to strafe with machine guns. A single P-47 could destroy or disable a dozen vehicles in one attack run. Multiply that by hundreds of aircraft making multiple sorties, and the impact was catastrophic. By noon, December 23rd, German columns across the entire Ardennes front were burning, scattered, or hiding under trees, hoping to avoid detection. December 23rd, 1400 hours, over Street Vith, Major Robert Johnson, no relation to the British wing commander, led a flight of 4 Thunderbolts hunting German armour. His flight found a panzer column, approximately 40 tanks and armoured vehicles moving west on a forest road. Johnson's radio call was calm and professional: targets of opportunity, line astern. I'm going in. The 4 Thunderbolts dove from 8,000 feet, accelerating to 400 miles per hour, releasing bombs at the last second before pulling up to avoid their own fragmentation. The first pass destroyed 6 vehicles. The columns scattered, tanks attempting to find cover under trees. The Thunderbolts circled and attacked again, this time with machine guns, their 50 caliber rounds punching through thin roof armor, killing crews, detonating ammunition. The attack lasted 15 minutes. When Johnson's flight departed out of ammunition and low on fuel, they left 23 destroyed or burning vehicles. The remaining tanks were abandoned by crews who fled into the forests on foot. Johnson's combat report, filed that evening, was typical of hundreds filed that day. Enemy armor destroyed. No losses to friendly aircraft. The scale of air operations, December 23rd through December 26th, defied comprehension. Allied forces flew more than 15,000 sorties in 4 days: fighters, fighter bombers, medium bombers, heavy bombers, all attacking German forces in the Ardennes or the supply routes feeding them. German losses to air attack during these 4 days exceeded losses to ground combat. 700 vehicles destroyed, 400 tanks and assault guns knocked out or abandoned, countless supply convoys obliterated before reaching forward units. The Luftwaffe attempted to contest Allied air superiority and was slaughtered. On December 24th alone, German fighters lost 84 aircraft in combat while shooting down 11 Allied planes. The exchange ratio was unsustainable. By December 26th, the Luftwaffe had effectively abandoned the Ardennes skies, ceding total air superiority to the Allies. The psychological impact on German ground forces was devastating. Soldiers who had advanced confidently for a week, protected by weather, now found themselves hunted from the sky whenever they moved. Tank commanders learned to move only at night or in fog. Supply convoys travelled in darkness without headlights, navigating by memory. Artillery batteries fired and immediately displaced, knowing that remaining in position meant attracting air attack within minutes. The Wehrmacht was being forced underground, abandoning roads for forest trails, hiding during daylight, accepting that any movement in clear weather was potentially suicidal. This was the experience Allied forces had inflicted on German armies in Normandy. Now, in the Ardennes, the lesson was being taught again with brutal efficiency. Modern mechanized warfare required air superiority. Without it, armies could not move, could not maneuver, could not sustain operations. December 25th, Christmas Day, the Luftwaffe launched its final major effort over the Ardennes, Operation Bodenplatte, a desperate attempt to regain some measure of air parity. 400 German fighters swept over Allied forward airfields, strafing parked aircraft, attempting to destroy Allied air forces on the ground the way Germany had been unable to destroy them in the air. The operation achieved tactical surprise. Allied air defences were minimal on Christmas morning, and German fighters destroyed approximately 300 Allied aircraft parked on airfields in Belgium and France. But the cost was catastrophic. 300 German aircraft shot down, most by anti-aircraft fire from ground defences. Worse, the Luftwaffe lost experienced pilots it could not replace. Allied losses were aircraft, machines that could be replaced within weeks. German losses were irreplaceable human expertise, squadron commanders, flight leaders, veteran pilots who had survived years of combat. Operation Bodenplatte was a Pyrrhic victory that crippled the Luftwaffe for the rest of the war. Forward air control, the system linking ground forces with air support, evolved rapidly during the Ardennes battle. American forward observers with infantry units could call airstrikes within 15 minutes through radio networks, connecting ground forces to fighter-bomber squadrons. Tank destroyers engaged German armour while calling air support to finish what ground fire started. Artillery observers directed fighter-bombers onto targets beyond artillery range. The integration of air and ground power created a synergy where each element multiplied the effectiveness of the other. German forces found themselves under attack from multiple dimensions, simultaneously artillery from behind American lines, tanks and infantry from defensive positions ahead, fighter-bombers from above. The Wehrmacht had no answer to this integrated firepower, except to hide and hope for fog. December 26th marked the turning point where air superiority became air dominance. Allied forces flew 2,000 sorties that single day, one aircraft taking off every 43 seconds somewhere in the Allied air network. German forces attempting to retreat from advanced positions found roads blocked by destroyed vehicles that air attacks had created. Supply columns trying to reach forward units were obliterated before delivery. German commanders radioed desperate pleas for air support that never came. The Luftwaffe had fuel for perhaps 50 sorties per day, barely enough to conduct reconnaissance, nowhere near enough to provide meaningful ground support. The disparity was so extreme that some German units reported going entire days without seeing a single Luftwaffe aircraft, while being attacked hourly by Allied planes. The impact on German fuel situation was particularly severe. Allied fighter bombers targeted fuel convoys, specifically understanding that destroying fuel trucks killed German mobility more effectively than destroying tanks. Fuel trucks, soft-skinned and highly flammable, were easy targets. When hit, they created spectacular secondary explosions that destroyed everything nearby. By December 28th, German commanders reported that more fuel was being destroyed en route to forward units than was actually reaching them. The mathematics were brutal. Every gallon of fuel Germany allocated to the offensive required transport from rear depots to forward positions. If half the fuel was destroyed in transit, then Germany needed to allocate twice as much to achieve the same effect. But Germany did not have twice as much. The fuel shortage that was choking the offensive was being exacerbated by air attacks that turned supply into suicide mission. Post-war analysis would calculate that Allied air power destroyed more German vehicles in the Ardennes than ground combat did. The exact ratio remains debated. Some estimates suggest 60% of German losses were air-inflicted. Others suggest 50%. What is undebatable is that air superiority was decisive. German tactical skill, operational planning, and soldier courage were negated by an enemy that owned the skies. Every clear day was a disaster for German forces. Every sortie was a reminder that Germany had lost the industrial war, the technological war, the war of production and resources. The Wehrmacht could still fight brilliantly at tactical level, but brilliance meant nothing when fighter bombers turned your columns into burning scrap metal before you could engage the enemy on the ground. The thunder from above had spoken, and its message was absolute. Germany could not win. Not in the Ardennes, not anywhere. The skies belonged to the Allies, and control of the air meant control of the battlefield. German soldiers, hiding in forests and waiting for darkness before they dared move, understood this with visceral certainty. They were no longer fighting a war they could win. They were surviving a war they had already lost. And every aircraft engine they heard overhead, every bomb that fell, every strafing run that killed their comrades, was proof that survival itself was becoming questionable. The offensive was dying from above, killed by air power more thoroughly than it could ever be defeated on the ground. The skies had cleared, and for the Wehrmacht, that clearing was the beginning of the end. January 3rd, 1945, 0600 hours, near Houffalize, Belgium. Private First Class Edward Peniche, 11th Armoured Division, watched German prisoners shuffle past his position, hundreds of them, hollow-eyed, frostbitten, moving with the mechanical shuffle of men beyond exhaustion. 2 weeks earlier, these same soldiers had been advancing confidently, part of an offensive that threatened to split the Allied armies and change the war's outcome. Now they were defeated, surrendering in groups so large that American units could barely process them. Peniche noticed something that would stay with him forever. Many German prisoners were walking without boots, their feet wrapped in rags. They had been soldiers in a modern mechanized army, and they were retreating like Napoleon's forces from Moscow. Behind them, the forests of the Ardennes had become a vast killing ground where the Wehrmacht's last great offensive was dying in fire and blood and frozen mud. The German retreat began not with orders but with reality, units running out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of hope. By December 30th, German forces across the entire Ardennes front had reached their culminating point, the moment in any offensive when attacking forces exhaust their strength and can no longer advance. Model and von Manteuffel both recognized this and requested permission to withdraw before American counterattacks encircled forward units. Hitler refused. Hold every meter. Continue attacking. Retreat is forbidden. The orders were insane, but they were absolute. German forces that could have withdrawn intact and established defensive lines were instead left exposed in advanced positions where American artillery and air power could destroy them systematically. The Houffalize pocket became the focus of American counterattacks from both north and south. First Army attacked south from the northern shoulder, while Third Army attacked north from the Bastogne corridor. The objective was to meet at Houffalize, cutting off German forces in the Bulge's westernmost extension. German units trapped in the pocket, elements of 5 divisions, perhaps 50,000 men, faced catastrophe. American artillery, positioned on the heights surrounding the pocket, fired continuously into the trap formations. Fighter bombers attacked whenever weather permitted. Infantry pressed inward from all sides, reducing the pocket mile by mile. German commanders radioed for permission to break out. Model, understanding the situation was hopeless, forwarded the request to Hitler. The response came back: fortress defense, hold at all costs, no retreat. It was a death sentence delivered from Berlin to soldiers dying in Belgian forests. January 8th, 1945, 11th Armoured Division advanced into positions German forces had abandoned overnight. What they found was testament to the completeness of German defeat. Hundreds of vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces sat abandoned on roadsides, out of fuel, or broken down and impossible to repair. Panther tanks, some of Germany's most sophisticated weapons, were disabled by their own crews, who had no fuel to move them and no ammunition to fight from them. Supply dumps contained abandoned equipment, winter clothing, rations, everything except fuel and ammunition, the only supplies that mattered. American engineers catalogued the abandoned material and reached a stunning conclusion. German forces in the Ardennes had lost more equipment to logistical failure than to combat action. They had not been defeated in battle, they had been starved into immobility and then destroyed piecemeal. The human cost was staggering and visible in every village and forest clearing. Frozen bodies, German and American mixed together, marked where desperate fighting had occurred. Field hospitals overwhelmed with wounded had been overrun and abandoned, leaving injured men to die of exposure. Civilian casualties were heavy. Belgian and Luxembourg civilians caught in combat zones, killed by artillery, crushed by tanks, shot in crossfire. The Ardennes, which had been a quiet sector in November, was now a wasteland of destroyed villages, burned forests, and frozen corpses that would not be recovered until spring. American burial teams worked continuously, trying to identify and recover bodies before snow covered them permanently. German dead were counted when possible and buried in mass graves. The arithmetic of death was relentless. 100,000 German casualties killed, wounded, captured in 6 weeks of fighting. January 12th, 1st and 3rd Armies linked up at Houffalize, closing the Houffalize pocket. German forces that had not escaped were now surrounded, subject to the same siege warfare they had imposed on Bastogne. But German commanders, seeing what had happened to forces that obeyed Hitler's hold, at all costs, orders, quietly ignored the directive, and withdrew what they could under cover of darkness. The retreat was chaotic units mixed together, without regard to organizational structure, officers leading whoever they could find, soldiers abandoning heavy equipment to move faster. Some units maintained discipline and withdrew in good order, fighting rearguard actions to cover their comrades' escape. Other units simply disintegrated, soldiers fleeing individually or in small groups, trying to reach German lines before being captured. The Wehrmacht, famous for its discipline even in defeat, was fragmenting under pressure it could no longer sustain. The material losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. 800 tanks destroyed, damaged, or abandoned, nearly every panzer and assault gun committed to the offensive. 1,000 aircraft lost in combat or operations, the Luftwaffe reduced to a remnant force incapable of meaningful operations, 6,000 vehicles of all types destroyed. The artillery that had opened the offensive with such devastating effect in mid-December was mostly abandoned in mid-January, unable to be moved for lack of fuel and trucks. Germany had gambled everything on the Ardennes Offensive and lost everything. The forces expended in 6 weeks of combat could have defended the Rhine River for 6 months. The fuel burned in the offensive could have sustained defensive operations until summer. The soldiers killed or captured were veteran troops who knew how to fight, irreplaceable expertise that Germany desperately needed for the battles ahead. American casualties: 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing, made the Ardennes the bloodiest battle American forces fought in the European theatre. The cost was severe but sustainable. American replacement depots could provide fresh divisions. American industry could replace lost equipment within weeks. American logistics could sustain operations indefinitely. The Allies had suffered a tactical setback that was strategically meaningless. Germany had suffered a tactical failure that was strategically catastrophic. The Battle of the Bulge, the name was emerging as journalists tried to describe the battlefield's shape, was ending with German defeat so complete that it guaranteed final defeat within months. January 16th, 1945. American forces reached positions that had been the front line on December 15th, the day before the offensive began. The Bulge was eliminated. The front line was restored. Everything Germany had gained was lost. What remained was counting casualties, repairing equipment, and preparing for the next phase, the drive into Germany itself. But the psychological impact transcended the tactical outcome. American soldiers who had been surprised, surrounded, and pushed back had held when holding seemed impossible. They had refused to break even when breaking was the rational response. They had fought in conditions outnumbered, outgunned, freezing, surrounded that should have led to collapse, and they had not collapsed. The American army had been tested as it had not been tested since the Civil War. It had proven itself in that testing, and soldiers who survived the Ardennes carried that knowledge forward into the final campaigns of the European War. The killing ground was silent now except for the wind through burned trees and the sound of recovery teams working. The village's street, Vith, Bastogne, Houffalize, dozens of others, were ruins that would take years to rebuild. The forests were graveyards where bodies would be discovered decades later. The roads were littered with destroyed equipment that would be slowly cleared over months. But the battle was over. Germany's last great offensive in the West had been defeated. The Wehrmacht was retreating toward the Rhine, pursued by Allied forces who now understood they faced a defeated enemy fighting only to delay inevitable surrender. The Bulge was gone. What remained was the final accounting of what the offensive had cost and what it had achieved. And the answer to that question, visible in the frozen bodies and burned vehicles and abandoned equipment scattered across the Ardennes, was nothing. Germany had achieved nothing except its own accelerated destruction. 1946, Nuremberg, Germany. In a converted courthouse where the surviving leaders of Nazi Germany faced judgment for war crimes, Allied interrogators questioned Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt about the Ardennes offensive. The old soldier, 70 years old and broken by defeat, was asked whether the operation had any chance of success. His answer was brutal in its honesty. Not from the beginning. We knew the fuel was insufficient. We knew the roads were inadequate. We knew Allied air superiority would be decisive once weather cleared. We knew all this. Hitler knew all this. He ordered the offensive anyway because he believed willpower could overcome mathematics. He was wrong. Von Rundstedt's assessment became the foundation for understanding why Germany's last great offensive failed, not because of single catastrophic mistake, but because the entire operation was founded on assumptions that contradicted reality. The Ardennes Offensive was defeated before it began by logistics, geography, and strategic impossibility. The fuel calculation was arithmetic that no amount of tactical brilliance could solve. The Wehrmacht required 12 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. German quartermasters stockpiled 5 million gallons. The shortfall, 7 million gallons, was supposed to come from captured American supplies. Post-war analysis examined every fuel depot in the Ardennes and calculated exactly what Germans could theoretically have captured if everything went perfectly. 3 million gallons maximum, and that assumed American engineers failed to demolish their own supplies, which they did not. Even in the impossible best case, Germany would have had 8 million gallons available, still 4 million gallons short of requirements. The operation was mathematically doomed. German forces advanced approximately 60 miles before fuel exhaustion stopped them. The Meuse River, the critical operational objective, was 75 to 80 miles from German start lines. The gap, 15 to 20 miles, might as well have been 1,500. Physics and mathematics killed the offensive, more certainly than combat did. The road network analysis revealed equally damning facts. The Ardennes region had 5 paved roads running east to west, each approximately 18 feet wide. German planners needed to move 30 divisions through these roads, approximately 600,000 men and 140,000 vehicles. Traffic analysis calculated maximum throughput under ideal conditions, 1 division per road per day. The operational plan required moving 30 divisions in 48 hours. The requirement exceeded capacity by a factor of 3. Traffic jams were not unfortunate accidents, they were inevitable consequences of attempting to move more forces than infrastructure could support. Even if German forces had faced no resistance, even if American defenses had collapsed completely, the traffic problem would have delayed the advance beyond the point where strategic objectives could be achieved. Geography had vetoed the plan before the first shot was fired. Weather was the variable. Hitler gambled would favour Germany 10 days of fog and clouds to ground Allied aircraft, allowing German forces to reach the Meuse before air superiority became decisive. Meteorological analysis of historical weather patterns in the Ardennes showed Hitler's gamble was based on anomaly rather than norm. December in the Ardennes typically had 3 to 4 days of fog, not 10. The 1944 weather 7 days of continuous cloud cover was statistical outlier. Hitler bet on abnormal weather continuing indefinitely. When weather cleared on December 23rd, exactly what meteorologists would have predicted happened. Allied air forces devastated exposed German columns. The offensive's timeline assumed weather protection for its entire duration. Climate history showed this assumption was fantasy. Germany gambled on anomaly and lost when normal patterns resumed. The intelligence failure analysis revealed how completely Germany misunderstood Allied response capabilities. German planning assumed 48 hours minimum before Allied reserves could respond to the offensive time for Shaif to recognize the attack's scale, time for orders to reach subordinate commands, time for units to disengage from current operations and redeploy. In reality, American forces began moving reserves within 12 hours of the offensive's start. Eisenhower recognized the strategic threat immediately and reorganized the entire Allied front in 36 hours. Patton pivoted Third Army in 72 hours, a maneuver German planners believed required 2 weeks. The German General Staff, shaped by years of fighting Soviet forces whose command structure was rigid and slow responding, had no experience with the flexibility and initiative that characterized American command. They planned for an enemy that responded like the Red Army. They faced an enemy that responded with unprecedented speed and flexibility. Strategic delusion permeated the entire operation at the highest levels. The plan assumed capturing Antwerp would force Britain and America to negotiate peace or at minimum suspend operations for months. This assumption ignored political reality. Roosevelt and Churchill had committed to unconditional surrender. They'd invested years and millions of lives in defeating Germany. No single tactical reverse, however shocking, would change strategic policy. Even if German forces had reached Antwerp, even if they had cut off 500,000 Allied troops, the result would have been escalation, not negotiation. America would have brought more divisions from the United States. Britain would have committed every reserve. The Soviet Union would have accelerated operations in the East. Germany's strategic assumption that military shock would produce political collapse was not just wrong, but backwards. The shock would have hardened Allied resolve and guaranteed Germany's total destruction rather than negotiated survival. The irreplaceable losses doomed Germany's strategic position for the war's final months. 100,000 German casualties in the Ardennes were veteran soldiers who knew how to fight, who formed the cadre around which defensive operations could be organized. 800 tanks were nearly every operational armored vehicle Germany had in the West. The fuel expended in 6 weeks of offensive operations in the Ardennes could have sustained defensive operations for 6 months. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they faced Wehrmacht units that were hollow shells equipped with obsolete weapons, manned by teenagers and old men, led by officers with minimal experience. The Ardennes Offensive consumed the last effective fighting forces Germany possessed. The result was not just tactical defeat, but strategic collapse. The Rhine defences fell in weeks rather than months because Germany had no forces left capable of sustained resistance. General Hasso von Manteuffel, interrogated by American intelligence officers in May 1945, provided the most succinct analysis. We were asked to reach Antwerp with resources sufficient to reach perhaps halfway. We were ordered to move 3 armies through roads that could support one. We were expected to capture enemy supplies while enemy was demolishing them. We were promised weather protection that meteorology said was unlikely, and we were told this would force the enemy to negotiate when every fact of politics said negotiation was impossible. The operation was madness from conception. That we came as close as we did to succeeding speaks to the skill of German soldiers. That we failed was inevitable from the moment Hitler drew his arrow on the map. The Ardennes Offensive became a case study taught in military academies worldwide, not as example of how to conduct operations, but as warning about how strategic wishful thinking creates tactical disasters. The lessons were catalogued and studied for generations. Logistics constrain operations more than tactics enable them. Geography is not optional. Weather is probability, not certainty. Allies respond faster than enemies expect. Strategic assumptions must align with political reality. Every lesson was written in blood. German blood, American blood, civilian blood spilled across the Ardennes forests. The anatomy of failure was complete and undeniable. Germany had launched an offensive that mathematics said was impossible, geography said was unachievable, logistics said was unsustainable, and strategy said was pointless, even if successful. That it was launched anyway, that hundreds of thousands of men were ordered to die for an operation whose failure was foreordained, was testament to how completely Nazi Germany had lost touch with reality in the war's final year. The offensive did not fail because of mistakes in execution. It failed because success was never possible. And that impossible offensive cost Germany what little chance it had remaining to delay inevitable defeat. January 7th, 1945. 21st Army Group Headquarters, Belgium. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood before assembled war correspondents and delivered the press conference that would nearly destroy the Anglo-American alliance. His words, carefully chosen for what he believed was appropriate modesty, detonated like diplomatic bombs across 2 continents. The battle has been most interesting. I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. He described how he took certain steps to ensure coherent defense, how he employed the whole available power of the British group of armies to stabilize the situation, how British troops had been brought into the line to save American forces from disaster. Montgomery intended to praise American soldiers while explaining British contributions. What emerged instead sounded like a British field marshal claiming personal credit for rescuing incompetent Americans from their own mistakes. Within 24 hours, the political firestorm was raging on both sides of the Atlantic. The American reaction was immediate and volcanic. Newspaper headlines screamed variations of the same theme. Montgomery claims credit for American battle. Editorial pages erupted with fury at British arrogance. Radio commentators demanded Montgomery's removal from command. The anger was not about facts. Montgomery had commanded American forces during the battle, and British units had played crucial roles, but about perception and respect. American soldiers had done the fighting and dying. American divisions had held Streatvith and Bastogne against overwhelming odds. American forces had counterattacked and driven German armies back. To hear a British field marshal claim credit for handling the battle felt like theft of valor, appropriation of sacrifice that belonged to American soldiers frozen in Ardennes foxholes. The rage was visceral and personal and threatened to poison military cooperation that the war's final campaigns desperately needed. General Omar Bradley, whose command had been split by Montgomery's assumption of northern forces, reached his breaking point. On January 11th, he met privately with Eisenhower and delivered an ultimatum disguised as professional assessment. I cannot continue to serve under conditions where American forces are subordinated to British command for political rather than military reasons. If you cannot guarantee that American armies will be returned to American command, then I must request relief and return to the United States. Bradley was not bluffing. He was arguably the most even-tempered of Eisenhower's senior commanders, the man who never threatened resignation, who always found ways to make coalition warfare function. If Bradley was at breaking point, the entire command structure was in danger of collapse. Eisenhower, facing the worst command crisis of his tenure as Supreme Commander, understood he needed to act decisively or watch the alliance fracture. George Patton's reaction was characteristically undiplomatic and publicly expressed. At a press conference on January 9th, a reporter asked Patton about Montgomery's statements. Patton's response was calculated insult wrapped in false courtesy. I have the greatest respect for Field Marshal Montgomery. I would rather work for a German general than serve under him, but I have great respect for him. The quote was published in every major American newspaper. British press, already celebrating Montgomery's heroics, reacted with outrage at American ingratitude. The cycle of recrimination accelerated American accusations of British arrogance, met with British accusations of American oversensitivity, cultural misunderstandings, compounding into genuine diplomatic crisis. What had been military coalition was becoming political warfare. The casualty statistics became weapons in the propaganda battle. American press emphasized that United States forces suffered 89,000 casualties in the Ardennes compared to 1,400 British casualties. The implication was clear. Americans had done the fighting, while British forces remained in reserve, claiming credit for victory. British press countered that Montgomery's deployment of reserves along the Meuse had prevented German breakthrough to Antwerp, that British planning and organizational skill had rescued chaotic American defensive efforts. Both narratives contained truth, both inflamed rather than informed. The actual military reality that coalition warfare required both American fighting power and British organizational expertise, that the battle was won by Allied cooperation rather than national heroism, was lost in nationalist chest-thumping and wounded pride. Eisenhower found himself in an impossible position. Military necessity had required giving Montgomery temporary command of American armies. The decision was operationally correct and had probably prevented disaster. But political reality now demanded reversing that decision to preserve alliance cohesion. On January 17th, Eisenhower returned 1st and 9th Armies to Bradley's command, restoring the command structure that existed before the German offensive. Montgomery, understanding that political damage had been done, wrote a letter to Bradley, attempting to clarify his press conference comments. I want to say that I am most distressed by the misinterpretation that has been placed on my remarks. I have the greatest admiration for the American soldier. The letter was well-intentioned but insufficient. The damage was done. Trust had been fractured. American commanders would work with Montgomery for the war's remaining months, but the easy cooperation of earlier campaigns was replaced by wary professionalism and barely concealed resentment. Winston Churchill, recognizing the crisis threatened the alliance at the moment when final victory was in sight, intervened with political skill that had characterized his entire leadership. On January 18th, he addressed the House of Commons with speech specifically crafted to repair Anglo-American relations. I have seen it suggested that the terrific battle which has been proceeding since December 16th on the American front is an Anglo-American battle. In fact, however, the United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. The Americans have engaged 30 or 40 men for every one we have engaged, and they have lost 60 to 80 men for every one of ours. This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. Churchill's words were broadcast globally, republished in every major newspaper, and began the slow process of defusing the crisis. The political aftermath extended beyond immediate command relationships into post-war planning. American military leadership, having watched British Field Marshal claim credit for American sacrifice, became skeptical of continued British influence over combined operations. The incident strengthened arguments within American government for independent American command structures in future conflicts. British leadership, watching American public opinion turn hostile over perceived slight, recognized that the special relationship between Britain and America was more fragile than assumed. Both nations learned that military alliance required not just operational coordination, but also constant attention to national sensitivities, respect for partners' contributions, and understanding that words mattered as much as actions in maintaining coalition cohesion. The deeper casualty of the political battle was Montgomery's reputation in American eyes. Before the Ardennes, Montgomery was controversial but respected, a capable commander whose caution frustrated more aggressive American generals. After his January 7th press conference, he became a figure of suspicion and resentment. His every future operation would be analysed through the lens of whether he was appropriating credit that belonged to others. His post-war memoirs, which emphasised his role in the Ardennes battle, would be dismissed by American veterans as self-serving fiction. The political battle he fought with words damaged his legacy more than any tactical defeat could have. He won the argument about his military contributions. He lost the larger war for respect and partnership, February 1945. At Yalta, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met to plan the war's final phase and post-war order, the Ardennes battle's shadow loomed over discussions. Stalin, informed by Soviet intelligence of the crisis and the casualties, used the information to argue for Soviet primacy in final operations against Germany. Why should the Western Allies, who had nearly been defeated in the Ardennes, lead the final assault on Berlin? Soviet forces had been advancing continuously for 3 years. They were stronger, more experienced, more capable. The argument was cynical manipulation of Allied difficulties, but it was effective. The decision to allow Soviet forces to capture Berlin, a decision with enormous post-war consequences, was influenced by Stalin's exploitation of Western vulnerability revealed in the Ardennes. The political battlefield's outcomes extended far beyond the immediate crisis, shaping the post-war world in ways no commander anticipated. The lessons for coalition warfare were absorbed and institutionalized. NATO, founded in 1949, incorporated command structures specifically designed to prevent the problems that plagued the Ardennes response. Unified command chains, clear delineation of national versus Allied authority, protocols for managing political sensitivities all emerged from hard lessons learned in December 1944 and January 1945. The Ardennes battle taught that military victory required political wisdom, that tactical success could be undermined by diplomatic failure, that allies needed constant care and feeding to maintain cohesion. These lessons, paid for in blood and political crisis, became foundational principles for Western military alliance that would endure for generations. The political battlefield of the Ardennes, though fought with words rather than weapons, shaped the future as profoundly as the military battle did. And its casualties, trust, respect, easy cooperation between allies, took far longer to recover than the physical casualties taken in Belgian forests. February 7th, 1945, the west bank of the Rhine River, Lieutenant Karl Henke, Volksgrenadier Division, stood in a defensive position overlooking the river and understood with absolute clarity that Germany had lost the war. Behind him, the positions that should have been manned by companies were held by platoons. The anti-tank guns that should have protected river crossings were missing, destroyed or abandoned in the Ardennes. The veteran NCOs who held defensive lines together were dead, buried in Belgian forests, or captured in the Houffalize pocket. Henke's division had 1,200 effective soldiers remaining from an authorized strength of 10,000. Every division on the Rhine was similarly gutted. The forces that could have defended Germany's last natural barrier had been consumed in Hitler's desperate gamble in the Ardennes. When American forces crossed the Rhine in March, they would face hollow shells rather than the veteran divisions that died trying to reach Antwerp. The Ardennes Offensive had not delayed Germany's defeat. It had guaranteed that defeat would be total rather than negotiated. The strategic impact was exactly opposite of what Hitler intended. The offensive was designed to split the Western Allies, force negotiated peace, and allow Germany to shift forces east to face the Soviets. Instead, it unified the Western Allies through shared sacrifice, hardened their resolve to accept nothing but unconditional surrender, and consumed the forces that could have delayed Soviet advance into Germany. By March 1945, Red Army forces were 80 miles from Berlin, while American forces were still west of the Rhine. The Ardennes Offensive had given Stalin months of additional time to advance deeper into Central Europe, ensuring Soviet domination of Eastern Europe for the next half-century. Hitler's gambit to save Germany instead guaranteed Soviet occupation of half the continent. The strategic outcome was catastrophically opposite to German intentions. April 9th, 1945. American forces advancing through the Ruhr pocket encountered entire German divisions surrendering without fight, not because they were cowards, but because they had no ammunition, no fuel, no functioning weapons. A Wehrmacht colonel, surrendering his regiment to American forces, explained to his captors, "We could have delayed you for months if we had the forces that died in the Ardennes. Every tank you see abandoned here could have been fighting if we had the fuel that was burned trying to reach Antwerp." Germany's defeat was inevitable, but the Ardennes made it immediate. The comment, recorded in American after-action reports, captured the essence of the offensive's failure. It accelerated the very outcome it was designed to prevent. Malmedy, Belgium, 1946. The war crimes trial of Joachim Paper and 73 other SS officers began in a converted courthouse at Dachau. The prosecution presented evidence of the Malmedy massacre and additional atrocities committed during the Ardennes Offensive: murdered prisoners, slaughtered civilians, burned villages. Piper, testifying in his own defense, claimed military necessity. "We were ordered to advance at any speed. Prisoners slowed us. We did what war required." The tribunal was unmoved. 43 defendants were sentenced to death, including Paper, though most sentences would later be commuted. The trials established legal precedent that would echo through subsequent war crimes prosecutions. Military necessity does not excuse atrocity, orders from superiors do not absolve individual responsibility, and violations of the laws of war will be prosecuted even in victory. The Ardennes Offensive's darkest chapter was being written in courtrooms rather than battlefields, establishing principles of military justice that would govern warfare for generations. 1949. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The United States Army Command and General Staff College conducted its first comprehensive study of the Ardennes campaign. The analysis, which would become foundational text for American military education, identified key lessons. Superiority in numbers and equipment means nothing if you cannot move forces to critical points quickly. Tactical surprise is achievable even against sophisticated intelligence. Small units fighting defensively can delay much larger forces if supplied and commanded competently. Air superiority is decisive once weather permits operations. Logistics limits operations more than tactics enables them. These lessons were codified into doctrine, taught to generations of officers, and applied in every American military operation for the next 75 years. The Ardennes battle became the template for understanding how modern mechanized warfare functioned and how coalition forces responded to crisis. Bastogne, Belgium, December 1954, 10th anniversary commemoration of the siege. General Anthony McAuliffe, now retired, returned to the town he defended and walked streets that had been battlefield. Belgian civilians, who had survived the siege alongside American soldiers, lined the streets to thank the veterans. An elderly woman approached McAuliffe with a letter handwritten, preserved for a decade. "Thank you for not leaving us. Thank you for holding when everyone said you could not hold. You gave us hope when hope seemed impossible." McAuliffe, reading the letter with tears in his eyes, understood that the battle's meaning transcended military outcomes. Bastogne had become a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds, proof that courage and determination could prevail against material superiority. The military battle was one story. The human story of soldiers and civilians who refused to surrender their dignity even when surrendering their lives seemed inevitable was the deeper legacy. 1973, Brussels, Belgium. NATO military exercise simulated Soviet invasion through the Fulda Gap in Germany. The exercise planners designing defensive operations drew explicitly on Ardennes lessons. Establish strong shoulders to prevent breakthrough from widening. Position reserves to counterattack penetrations. Maintain air superiority at all costs. Integrate artillery and air power to multiply combat effectiveness. Trust small units to fight independently when communications fail. Every principle had been learned in Belgian forests in December 1944. NATO's entire defensive doctrine for Central Europe was shaped by how American forces had responded to German offensive. The military alliance born from World War II was fighting theoretical battles using lessons from its founding crisis. The Ardennes echoed through decades of Cold War planning. 1984, West Point Military Academy. Cadet James Morrison studied the Ardennes campaign for his senior thesis and interviewed veterans, Americans who had fought there, Germans who had survived it. One interview captured the war's absurdity. Private First Class Robert Lee, who had defended Bastogne, and Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, who had besieged it, met for the first time since the war. They sat in Lee's living room in Pennsylvania and discussed the battle they had fought against each other. Schmidt asked the question that haunted him. Why did you not surrender? You were surrounded, outnumbered, freezing. Surrender would have been rational. Lee's answer was simple. Because we were Americans, we don't quit. Schmidt nodded and replied, I understand. We Germans did not quit either, even when quitting was rational. Maybe that is why the war lasted as long as it did. Nobody knew when to stop fighting. The conversation, recorded for Morrison's thesis, captured the tragedy of the Ardennes, two armies fighting brilliantly for objectives that were meaningless, casualties mounting for strategic outcomes that benefited neither side. 2004, Iraq. American forces conducting urban warfare operations in Fallujah applied lessons first learned in the Ardennes 60 years earlier. Small unit initiative when higher command cannot maintain communications. Integration of air and ground power. Rapid resupply to surrounded forces. Junior officers making tactical decisions normally reserved for colonels. An army captain, pinned down in Fallujah and surrounded by insurgents, later explained his decision-making. I remembered reading about Bastogne at West Point. They were surrounded too. They held because they refused to believe they could not hold. So that is what we did. We held. The Ardennes battle, filtered through 6 decades and multiple wars, still shaped how American military leaders thought about combat. The echoes were transmitted across generations, lessons written in blood and frozen in institutional memory. 2024, Bastogne, Belgium, 80th anniversary commemoration. The last living veterans of the battle, men now in their late 90s, returned one final time to the forests where they fought. They were few, perhaps 24 American veterans, a handful of Germans, some Belgian civilians who had been children during the siege. They gathered at the monument in Bastogne Square, where McAuliffe's reply, "Nuts," was commemorated in bronze. A Belgian official read the names of the dead American, British, German, Belgian civilians, 18,000 names, taking nearly 2 hours. The veterans stood in silence, remembering comrades who never left these forests, remembering why they fought, remembering what the battle cost. As the ceremony concluded, one veteran, Private First Class Edward Miller, 101st Airborne, was asked by a journalist what the battle meant to him 80 years later. Miller's answer was quiet and final. It meant everything. It was the moment we proved to ourselves that we could win the war. Not might win, could win, would win. Everything after Bastogne was just finishing what we started there. The last blitzkrieg echoed across 80 years, shaping military doctrine, alliance structures, and understanding of warfare itself. The battle that was supposed to save Germany instead destroyed it. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allies instead united them. The operation that was supposed to change the war instead proved the war's outcome was inevitable. Hitler had gambled everything on one final throw of the dice and lost catastrophically. The Wehrmacht had fought brilliantly and achieved nothing. American forces had been surprised, surrounded, pushed back, and had held when holding seemed impossible. The legacy was complicated, layered, profound, military lessons about logistics and coalition warfare, political lessons about alliance management, human lessons about courage and sacrifice and the cost of refusing to surrender. The forests are peaceful now. The villages are rebuilt. The roads where tank battles raged carry civilian traffic. Tourists visit the monuments and museums, trying to imagine what happened here when the world was at war. But for those who fought, for those who remember, the Ardennes is forever frozen in December 1944. The snow, the cold, the fear, the determination, the absolute certainty that this moment would determine everything. They held, they fought, they refused to break. And in refusing to break, they broke Hitler's last chance to avoid total defeat. That was the Ardennes Offensive's final legacy. Not the battles won or lost, not the casualties suffered or inflicted, but the proof that free people, when pushed to the edge of defeat, would choose to fight rather than surrender. That choice, made in frozen foxholes and surrounded villages across the Belgian Ardennes, echoed through generations. It echoes still, and it always will.